The Committee on Financial Services will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Beyond Silicon Valley, Expanding Access to Capital Across America. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning. I want to welcome our members today to a hearing on expanding access to capital, and I really look forward to this great panel's testimony. Over my financial career prior to entering Congress in Arkansas and Texas, I've seen firsthand the incredible entrepreneurial talent that's alive and well outside traditional venture and financial hubs like New York or San Francisco. Across our country, Americans are building companies that can drive our economy forward. Yet too often, these promising startups lack access to local advice and capital that they need to grow, scale, and succeed. Right now, virtually all venture funding pours into just a few coastal cities, leaving the innovators and entrepreneurs of flyover country often overlooked and underfunded. When capital circulates in this geographically concentrated eddy, investors in the economy at large miss out on big ideas, innovations, and economic breakthroughs that can and do emerge from the labs, kitchen tables, and garages in Arkansas, Nebraska, or Ohio. Talent and ambition don't stop at state borders, and neither should investments. In Little Rock, we've seen companies like Aptigee, which started from scratch and grew into a powerhouse by providing communication tools to schools nationwide. That's the innovation born in Arkansas, benefiting students everywhere. It's proof that when investments are made outside of traditional hubs, incredible things can happen. At the same time, the number of public companies in the United States has declined dramatically from over 7,000 30 years ago to fewer than 4,000 today. In my view, threatened litigation, excessive cost, and regulatory burdens have made it much harder for small businesses to go public, shutting out entrepreneurs and everyday investors alike. We must ensure that local incubators and small business investors have the support they need, and that those aspiring risk-taking teams, regardless of where they're based, can succeed. Our capital markets should work for everyone. That means reducing barriers for startups to access funding, incentivizing investment in regional businesses, and reforming outdated regulations that improve access to growth capital to ensure that a public offering is more of a viable option once again. By incentivizing investments in regional startups, supporting local incubators, and streamlining rules, we can create an environment where more companies can scale, thrive, and ultimately become public companies. And for the means that we're ensuring that we're not just creating opportunities for companies to grow, but also expanding investment opportunities for Americans that want to be a part of that growth. For too long, investment opportunities, particularly in private markets, have been reserved for the select few. By broadening access, we create more avenues for wealth creation, allowing everyday investors to share in the long-term prosperity that comes from innovation. Modernizing our securities laws can help break down these barriers so that every founder, regardless of background or location, has the resources to support and build the next great American success story. The policies that we're discussing today will not only expand across access to capital, they will also strengthen our economy and create lasting opportunities for millions of Americans. With that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I recognize the ranking member of our committee, Mrs. Waters, for 4 minutes opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hill. Before I begin, I want to comment about the outrageous national security breach reported yesterday. It is my understanding that the details of the attack were shared with someone who wasn't cleared, putting the lives of those involved and the whole mission in jeopardy. This latest breach follows unlawful access to the critical payment systems and the data of Americans. Mr. Chair, I hope you agree that enough is enough. I wish we had more positive information to report on, but the incompetence of this administration is glaring. With that, I appreciate today's hearing on capital formation. The reality is that our economic outlook is bleak and is entirely of the president's own doing. Mr. Chair, I want to take a moment to read excerpts that highlight the magnitude of the economic crisis created by Donald Trump. From Reuters, more than $4 trillion in stock market values has evaporated since Trump took office. From the Financial Times, quote, economists expect Trump's policies to slow economic growth and fuel higher inflation. From INC magazine, Trump's tariffs are causing some startups to scrap their IPOs. From Reuters, J.P. Morgan, chief global economist, says the risk of a recession will rise to, quote, probably 50% or above when Trump's April 2nd tariffs kick in. This is the state of our economy. As a result of Trump's disastrous policies and dumb trade wars, our stock markets are in chaos, and the strong economy he inherited from President Biden is no more. Right now, instead of expanding their business or investing in their workers, business owners are dealing with a Trump-induced recession and are panicking at the thought of higher prices for goods and raw materials from overseas. All of this is slowing hiring, killing innovation, and making it harder for American companies to compete globally. But Trump's economic policies aren't just hurting American businesses and workers. No, Trump is an equal opportunity destroyer of finances. People preparing to retire, people he has forced to retire, and the people he has wrongfully fired have all seen their nest eggs and hard-earned savings reduced to rubble. Instead of displaying leadership, competence, and care, Trump has been golfing at Mar-a-Lago, promoting his own Mimicon and filming Tesla ads, actually on the White House lawn for the richest man on earth, Elon Musk. Unfortunately, that's not all. This month, Trump signed an executive order gutting the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund. Mr. Chair, for over 30 years, CDFIs have been strongly supported by Democrats and Republicans. We have them in our districts and have all seen firsthand the critical work they do in supporting small businesses in underserved communities. Eliminating CDFIs because they serve the underserved is the MAGA equivalent of cutting off your nose to spite your face. This same executive order would also gut the Minority Business Development Agency. And make no mistake, these cuts to working-class families in underserved communities and the small businesses that they serve are all designed to pay for the only thing the Trump administration actually cares about, tax cuts for billionaires.
I thank the gentlewoman.
I yield back.
She yields back. The chair recognizes the chair of the Subcommittee on Capital Markets, Ms. Wagner from Missouri, for a 1-minute opening statement.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you know what? I couldn't be more optimistic about our economy and the direction that our country is moving. As the chairman noted, talent and innovation aren't confined to the coasts, and investments shouldn't be either. This hearing is about giving hard-working, everyday Americans access to the kinds of high-growth opportunities that for too long have been reserved for the wealthy. So Congress can help Main Street investors invest and save for the future. We've done this before, Mr. Chairman. The Bipartisan Jobs Act showed how smart, balanced reforms can open up markets without sacrificing investor protections. Now it's time to build on that success by helping more companies go public, expanding access to capital for all, and creating real wealth-building opportunities for millions of Main Street investors in our congressional districts, the 2nd Congressional District of Missouri, and the nation. Let's cut the red tape from our rules and strengthen our markets, because more opportunity means a stronger, better economy for all, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Capital Markets, Mr. Sherman, for a 1-minute opening statement.
I join the ranking member in noting that everyone on that signal chat knew they were exchanging war plans on a signal chat, not a system for classified information. Then they added a journalist to the chat. Then the Secretary of State lied about it, only to be corrected by Trump's National Security Council. The SEC oversees the largest capital markets in the world and in the history of the world. We're dealing with $100 trillion of securities. Our entire economy, the world's economy, is dependent upon it. So let's just let some guy like Big Balls take a whack at it. Well, he did. $50,000 payout for everybody at the SEC who leaves. What gaps does that have in enforcement? What gaps does that have in the ability to approve a registration of securities? We won't know because we don't know who takes that buyout. But we do know that the people taking the buyout are the ones that the private sector values the most, and they're going to make a lot of money in the private sector. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Today we welcome the testimony of Steve Case. Mr. Case is the chairman and CEO of Revolution, an investment firm backing entrepreneurs at every stage of their development. His entrepreneurial career began in 1985 when he co-founded America Online, AOL. Candace Matthews Brocken. Ms. Matthews Brocken is the general partner of Lightship Capital, a Cincinnati-based venture capital fund that invests in companies throughout the Midwest. Bill Newell. Mr. Newell is the senior business advisor and former CEO of Sutro Biopharma, a biotech firm focused on the research, development, and manufacturing of next-generation cancer medicines. Joel Trotter. Mr. Trotter is the co-founder of Latham Watkins National Office. He was a principal author of the IPO-related provisions in the Jobs Act of 2012. And Amanda Seen. Ms. Seen is the director of the Alabama Securities Commission. We welcome all of you. Thanks for taking time to be with us. You'll be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony, and without objection, your written testimony will be made part of the record. Mr. Case, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and Chairman Hill and Ranking Member Waters and members of this U.S. House Committee on Financial Services. It's my pleasure to be here to discuss the future of entrepreneurship in America. Indeed, it warms my heart to be participating in a House hearing titled Beyond Silicon Valley, Expanding Access to Capital Across America. I want to start by acknowledging that for decades, despite party differences, legislation to encourage entrepreneurship and expand access to capital for entrepreneurs has largely received bipartisan support. Today's hearing underscores this committee's commitment to prioritizing entrepreneurship and innovation, and I thank you for your leadership in making this a shared national effort. 4 decades ago, I co-founded America Online, AOL, a company that helped usher in the internet revolution. AOL was the first internet company to go public, and at its peak, nearly half of all internet users went through the platform. After AOL, I dedicated myself to backing the next generation of entrepreneurs as founder, chairman, and CEO of Revolution. Based here in Washington, D.C., Revolution's mission is to build disruptive, innovative companies that upend age-old industries with a unique focus on startups based outside of the coastal tech hubs. Startups are indeed the lifeblood of our economy, driving innovation, creating jobs, and fueling growth in red and blue communities nationwide. Indeed, new businesses play a significant role in net new job creation, according to data from the National Bureau of Economic Research. Yet entrepreneurs, especially those outside of Silicon Valley and Boston and New York, still face significant challenges in accessing the capital they need to start and scale. In 2017, when Revolution launched our Rise of the Rest seed fund, led at the time by J.D. Vance, who is now our vice president, roughly 75% of venture capital flowed to just 3 states, California, Massachusetts, and New York, with 47 states left to share the remaining 25%. We've made some progress, but unfortunately, the split remains largely the same today. The federal government can help close this gap, and there is strong precedent to do so. In 2011, I was part of the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness with a number of leaders from finance and tech. Our proposals eventually became the bipartisan Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act, the Jobs Act, which passed the House by a vote of 390 to 23. The Jobs Act included, as you know, 3 key goals. First, make it easier to launch and invest in startups via crowdfunding. Second, allow those seeking investment to make general solicitation appeals. And third, create an IPO on-ramp for young companies to make going public a little easier. Given the success of the Jobs Act, as well as the outsized role startups play in job creation and economic growth, it makes sense for this committee to explore additional ways to expand access to capital for entrepreneurs and enhance the ability of more investors to participate in private markets. First, on the IPO front, while late-stage companies have had access to growth capital in recent years, that funding option is not guaranteed, and more companies may need to consider going public at an earlier stage in their development, which makes having a viable path for IPOs critical. Additionally, Revolution, partnering with PitchBook, found that between 2011 and 2021, more than 1,400 new venture firms emerged from smaller ecosystems across the country. These firms are crucial because they are much more likely to invest in local and regional startups. This committee can take steps to support and sustain these regional funds, including by expanding the pool of potential investors and by streamlining the regulations that apply to up-and-coming venture funds. To be clear, none of the reforms proposed should come at the expense of appropriate investor protection, which is, of course, important. But at the same time, we need to make sure we strike an appropriate balance. If we want more capital funding more entrepreneurs, we need to make some changes, some of which could create some risk. But at the same time, if we make no changes and we just maintain the status quo, we are in fact constraining the pool of investors and of entrepreneurs that we need to ensure that we continue to have a robust innovation economy, not just on the coast, but across the country. We all know that talent exists everywhere. This committee is in a unique position to pass legislation to support the next generation of entrepreneurs and investors and create more opportunity for places that often feel left behind. I applaud the efforts you are taking today to level the playing field, and as we approach the 250th anniversary of our nation next year, empower entrepreneurs nationwide to write the next chapter of the American story. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Case. Mr. Newell, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Hill, Ranking Member Waters, and distinguished members of the House Committee on Financial Services. I'm honored to appear before you today to discuss capital formation in the United States and the need for reforms that support entrepreneurs, protect investors, and promote innovation. My name is Bill Newell, and I'm a senior business advisor with Sutro Biopharma. I've been at Sutro since January 2009, until recently serving as its CEO. I also serve on the board of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization and chair BIO's Capital Formation Working Group. I want to commend the members of this committee for working on a bipartisan basis to improve access to capital through targeted reforms that protect investors and right-size needed regulations. In the last Congress, this committee advanced a number of measures, and I hope that this Congress will be able to move that legislation into law. Sutro Biopharma focuses on research, development, and manufacturing of next-generation cancer medicines. Our company is 22 years old. I was employee 19, and until recently, we had over 300 employees. In many ways, Sutro's corporate journey is a microcosm of the small biotech experience. We were initially financed by private investors, including venture capitalists. We IPO'd in 2018, benefiting from the Jobs Act of 2012 that makes it easier for small companies to go public. All told, Sutro has raised almost $1.6 billion in the company's history. That eyebrow-raising figure in our over 20-year company journey is, unfortunately, very typical of the small biotech experience in bringing a product to market. Bringing a new medicine to approval is very, very expensive and risky. In this environment, many companies in our industry have had to downsize and end programs because of limited capital availability. Unfortunately, Sutro is no exception. It takes on average 10.5 years for a candidate entering phase 1 to reach approval. The average R&D cost to produce a new pharmaceutical from discovery to launch is $2.3 billion. Drug discovery is expensive. That's why access to capital is so crucial. We're in a constant race against time to develop a life-saving drug before funding runs out. 13 years ago, this committee passed the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act. The Jobs Act right-sized regulations for small and emerging growth companies, and we need to build off the success of the Jobs Act. Private markets play a crucial role in the growth and success of small biotech firms. A company often starts with just angel investors. Angels are the critical first dollars that bridge the valley of death for the biomedical innovation ecosystem. We need more angels, not fewer. The Equal Opportunity for All Investors Act expands the pool of angel investors. The current definition for accredited investor is not based on the assessment of investment risks, how to evaluate opportunities, or conduct due diligence. Rather, the current standard is entirely predicated on wealth and the ability to absorb total loss. This bill directs the SEC to create a thorough accredited investor exam that allows more people to who understand investing to participate in the marketplace. We have the deepest, most liquid, and most competitive equity markets in the world, but fewer companies are going public these days for a variety of reasons. It's expensive to be a public company. Funds must be diverted away from critical research and development, clinical development, and scientists, and more towards regulatory filings, paperwork, quarterly reporting, and accountants and lawyers. The emerging growth company designation is a critical reason why the Jobs Act was so successful at incentivizing IPOs, especially from smaller companies. The EGCS status currently lasts for 5 years. The 5-year timeline is simply too short for small biotechs. It's like having a tax system based on age instead of income, which makes no sense. The Helping Startups Continue to Grow Act allows for an additional 5-year extension of the EGC exemption. The SEC needs to report on and revise the definition of small business. The non-controversial Small Entity Update Act does just that. It passed this committee 42-0 last Congress and passed the House 367-8. So we appreciate the strong bipartisan support for this legislation. The SEC also needs to update their public float threshold triggers. Chairman Tim Scott included a provision in his bill empowering Main Street in America Act that would require the SEC to revise thresholds for smaller reporting companies to account for a 12-month rolling average of $700 million or less for their public float. By converting public floats to a rolling average trigger, it avoids surprise expenses for companies that may have a small temporary blip in their stock price. In conclusion, I support transparent and reliable capital markets, both private and public, that allow companies to efficiently graduate or transition from funding structures while minimizing overlap and reporting and disclosure burdens. Thank you for inviting me to provide my perspective on these issues, and I welcome the committee's questions.
Thanks, Mr. Newell. Ms. Matthews-Brocken, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chairman, Ranking Member Waters, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Candace Matthews-Brocken. I'm the founding partner of Lightship Capital and CEO of Lightship Foundation and a native Ohioan. Recently, my team and I launched a fund of funds called Anchor. But really, to understand why we launched that fund of funds, let me first start with the journey that brought us here. Lightship started as a nonprofit focused with one goal: helping entrepreneurs in communities that often get overlooked. While our early work had great successes, we soon realized that helping individual businesses just wasn't enough. The larger system around them still needed fixing. To truly support entrepreneurs, we had to build something bigger. So through acquisition, we expanded our work by bringing together 3 nationally recognized programs: New Me Accelerator, Black Tech Week, and Founder Gym. Each had strong educational resources in support of communities. Black Tech Week, in particular, has been running for 11 years as a major tech conference that is now located in Cincinnati, Ohio. By combining these organizations under the Lightship Foundation, we gave them the resources and structure needed to grow and support even more entrepreneurs around America. We couldn't do this alone, however. We've been supported by amazing public and private partners like Jobs Ohio, who share our vision for economic development and growth. We then created our own venture fund to invest directly in talented entrepreneurs who were overlooked by traditional investors. But even as we saw success, we discovered an even bigger problem. Venture capital is still mostly focused in coastal cities like New York and San Francisco. Talented founders like us in the Midwest and South and other regions are just still left out. And that's why we started Anchor. Anchor originally began with a series of meetings around the country with groups of experienced fund managers who were frustrated by the barriers we were all facing. Even though we had proven ourselves, we struggled to raise money because we weren't from traditional venture capital markets. This created what we call emerging manager redlining, an unintentional bias against new and regional funds, particularly outside of the major coastal cities. By blocking first-time and emerging funds, we unintentionally support geographic bias, limit opportunities for promising managers, and miss out on potentially great returns. Anchor directly tackles this market failure. Our fund of funds help support promising new managers across the Heartland, Midwest, and South. We provide resources they need to succeed and generate strong returns for their investors. And we've introduced 3 key innovations at Anchor. Now, first of all, Anchor recently received an SBIC green light from the Small Business Administration, a crucial first step that signals confidence that the SBA is our anchor investor, and it helps attract further investment. Secondly, our fund structure helps investors benefit from successful startups while reducing the risk of large losses across the entire portfolio. And lastly, we eliminated the double fees that are common in traditional fund of funds, making Anchor more affordable and more attractive to institutional investors like pension funds and endowments. However, there are still policy barriers that we need to address. Right now, venture capital funds benefit from certain exemptions under the Investment Advisors Act, but fund of funds like ours do not. We have to register. Extending these exemptions equally to all venture funds, including fund of funds, would remove unnecessary hurdles and modernize investment rules. Secondly, current law also limits venture funds to just 250 investors. And with inflation, this just doesn't work. So for a $2 billion fund like ours, that means each investor must contribute around $8 million on average, effectively excluding 99% of Americans. Increasing the investor cap from 250 to something like 2,000 as proposed by the DEAL Act would dramatically lower the entry point, allowing more Americans to participate. And finally, we suggest one more policy improvement. Public investment funds, like public pensions and endowments, should be required to review proposals from first-time and emerging managers. They don't have to invest, but they shouldn't be allowed to have rules to automatically exclude new managers, many of those managers being in the middle of the country. This simple change would significantly reduce geographic bias and democratize access to venture capital across the country. Building and supporting fund of funds like Anchor is the key solution to addressing capital inequality in America's underserved regions. Reducing barriers to these funds isn't just helpful, it's essential. It's how we ensure economic growth and innovation in every part of our country. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions and continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Trotter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Hill, Ranking Member Waters, and members of the committee, it's good to be with you here today. Based on my experience as a leader of the IPO task force, I'm pleased to share my perspectives on reforms to expand access to capital across America. The Jobs Act of 2012 is a bipartisan success story and a model for the innovative solutions you're now considering. 13 years ago, Congress enacted our IPO on-ramp proposal by an overwhelming bipartisan majority, and President Obama signed it into law. Title I has been called the most successful title in the Jobs Act, and academic research has concluded that the IPO on-ramp provisions significantly increased IPO volume. The Jobs Act succeeded, and the proposals under consideration today bear the same hallmarks of that success. I fully support the committee's efforts to enact balanced reforms in federal securities regulation, and I urge your support for the proposals listed in my written remarks. These proposals represent measured, carefully calibrated solutions to facilitate capital formation. With that said, I'd like to make 3 points. First, the Jobs Act changed none of the robust anti-fraud provisions of the federal securities laws, and neither would any of the proposals before you today. I cannot overstate the importance of this point. There's a long list of liability provisions and compliance obligations that apply to all public companies. They are extensive and rigorous, and they will remain in full force and effect, undiminished by any of the proposals before you. Second, the Jobs Act used a balanced approach that scales the regulatory burden to a company's size and maturity. The IPO on-ramp concept allowed the regulatory burden to scale to the size of the company, a simple but powerful concept borrowed from SEC rules. In the debate over more versus less regulation, this is a compelling way forward. Rather than more versus less, balanced regulation that scales over time. This approach encourages capital formation while maintaining a much greater level of securities regulation for mature public companies. That greater regulation includes the internal controls audit of Sarbanes-Oxley Section 404B, which will continue to apply to larger public companies. Critics of scaled regulation overlook this point when they cite the high-profile accounting scandals that led to the enactment of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. It's important to remember those companies were huge, mega-cap, Fortune 50 companies that would never have been eligible for any of the relief from Section 404B of Sarbanes-Oxley. Neither the Jobs Act nor any of today's proposals would give regulatory relief to companies of that size. Even if you pass every proposal before you today, every public company must undergo audit by a PCAOB registered auditing firm and comply with all of the robust anti-fraud provisions of the federal securities laws. And all of the largest U.S. public companies, representing nearly all of total U.S. market capitalization, would remain subject to Section 404B of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. That brings me to my third and final point. Of the proposals before you, two in particular stand out: extending the IPO on-ramp and expanding the category of well-known seasoned issuers. I discussed both of these proposals at length in my written remarks. They build on decades of successful experience promoting capital formation without compromising fundamental investor protections. They would have the greatest impact of the proposals before you, and I urge you to adopt them, along with the many other excellent proposals under consideration today. You have the opportunity to build on the success of the Jobs Act and its lessons. And given the direct connection between capital formation and job creation, the opportunity is compelling. I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Director, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Hill, Ranking Member Waters, and distinguished members of this committee. Thank you for inviting me to share with you the perspective of state securities regulators, or regulators if you're from the South. It is a privilege for me to be here today, and I hope that you'll consider our important roles as you continue deliberations on the legislation before this committee. My testimony will focus on preserving the role of states in overseeing our local markets, in facilitating responsible capital formation, and I will underscore our critical role in protecting investors. The states are proud to be part of a team of regulators responsible for promoting stability in our financial markets and protecting investors. This heavy responsibility grew out of a recognized need by a state legislature over a century ago to promote transparency and honesty in our markets. Many of the principles first crafted by states were adopted at the federal level to address the abuses that led up to the stock market crash of 1929. In the decades since, the U.S. capital markets have flourished, both providing extraordinary capital for businesses and safe opportunities for investors to build sound financial futures. For the past 100 years, the United States of America has stood out before all other nations as the greatest economy and strongest engine for growth in history. There has never been anything like it before, and in my opinion, never will be again. This while being subjected to reasonable regulation. It is the foundation of our success. History has also shown us that we must constantly examine our regulatory framework and, where needed, adjust. Again, states have been leaders in this effort, including by developing new regulatory frameworks for capital formation, while also serving as the early warning detectors for new and emerging threats to investors. As Congress examines further revisions to the federal securities laws, including legislation aimed at capital formation in rural areas, we urge you to strongly consider and embrace the state's important role in capital formation and continue to promote our ability to oversee local markets. This ensures that smaller offerings, the kind most likely to reach Main Street investors, are being reviewed by us, that we are able to exclude bad actors from our markets, and that we can keep supporting our entrepreneurs and small businesses, all so that investors can continue to trust the local markets in which they invest. It's hard to talk about capital formation, though, without mentioning the potential for fraud and abuse. I've witnessed firsthand the aftermath of the devastation brought about by bad actors. My first few cases as a young lawyer followed the 2008 financial crisis triggered by the collapse of the subprime mortgage market. During the course of the investigation, I met with defrauded investors from all walks of life. I heard their stories, and their pain was palpable. I knew these people. They lived in our communities, and they turned to us for help. Many of our victims were small business owners that had turned to private markets for funding when lenders were pulling back. Fraudsters exploit every opportunity. Through the years, I've met with thousands of investors across Alabama and the U.S. I've sat with them in their living rooms as they tearfully shared the details of bad investments that ultimately caused them to lose their life savings. The 2008 crisis left investors distrustful of our markets and our regulators. And we have worked hard for years to rebuild that trust. While states responded to the concerns of investors, Congress worked hard to provide stronger regulatory frameworks to re-strengthen our markets and restore the trust of Americans. Over 2,000 years ago, Euripides said, "They say the gods themselves are moved by gifts, and gold does more with men than words." While I still believe, and I know you do too, that people are good, we are not infallible, and missteps can have major consequences. History has shown us over and over again. But it has also shown us that strong oversight and accountability have a significant deterrent impact, and that is why I urge you to consider the state's critical role in ensuring that our financial industry players are subject to some level of oversight and that they can be held accountable when the public demands they should be. In closing, I want to emphasize that we do understand and share the same goals as the members of Congress who support our robust public markets. And as we seek ways and opportunities for investors to strengthen these public markets, consider the state's important role. Thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Director. We'll turn to member questions, and I'll yield to myself 5 minutes for starting that process. Ms. Matthews, Brock and Keene, from your experience, I really enjoyed your testimony about small first-time fund managers. I know that firsthand, and I know how the consulting system is biased against first-time managers going to institutional investors. So I really appreciate your testimony. I think that is informative to the committee. You talked about your priority on regional diversity as well, and you talked about two principal reforms you thought that would be helpful for smaller funds, the fund-to-funds approach and the limitations there, and then the limitation on total number of investors. Would you just reiterate that point and compare it to the work you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, really the minimum viable fund size is really around $50 million, right? And so in order to kind of get to that number, you have to bring in a group of investors that can write a certain size check. The bigger the check, the easier it is to kind of chunk that down. For a fund of funds, it's a much bigger fund. So for us, we're raising a $2 billion fund. Even if we were raising $1 billion or $500 million, it's a pretty significant check size that you need in order to kind of close the fund. So for us, what we're asking here, as we're talking about the DEAL Act in particular, is to kind of shrink that number down. So if we're raising, like I just said, $2 billion, we need people to write $8 million checks, or lots of people who can write $100 or $200 million checks. I would bet almost every person in this room who has fundraised knows exactly who those people are in this country. It's a very small number of people. What we're looking to do is to give more people that opportunity. Beyond that, I know we kind of both talked about kind of the number of investors, but I also kind of mentioned pension funds and public investment funds. Right now, our universities, our teachers' unions, they're sending their dollars to the coasts. And each time they do that, they're building wealth on the coasts, and that money stays there long term. Now, does some of the money come back with returns? It absolutely does. But those fund managers make money. The families then grow there in those individual cities. We find angel investors growing there and then spending more money on companies there. We're also seeing those tech companies grow and thrive, and it's not coming back to the center of the country.
Thank you very much for your views on this important set of measures. Mr. Case, she makes the case that you've been talking about in terms of the bias towards the rise of the rest, of the halo effect, the gravitational pull back to the coast, despite your best efforts on mentorship, availability of directors, coaching, and funding from the work you've done over the past 2 decades. What are we missing? What incentive system is you think that we should change?
Well, as I said in my testimony, it's a mix of things, but some of it is creating a sense in these communities in the middle of the country that they have an opportunity to participate in the innovation economy. A lot of people, as you well know, in places like Arkansas and others, feel like they need to leave. They go to Silicon Valley or some other place. One great story I mentioned in my written testimony is an entrepreneur who was actually at a hedge fund in San Francisco, and he came up with an idea for a platform called Acre Trader, and he moved back to Arkansas, to Fayetteville, to start that company. But he left Arkansas to go to the coast because he didn't feel like he could kind of find his way if he stayed. He was an exception that came back to start the company there. How do we create more of those where fewer people are leaving? There's less of what some have called a brain drain of people leaving different cities in the middle of the country to go to the coast. And how do you create a boomerang of people returning? It requires time. It doesn't happen overnight, but having venture capital in those communities to back the next generation of companies, having some of those companies graduate to be successful enough to go public and create wealth for all the investors, but also the employees, some of whom then want to start other companies, some of whom then will become angel investors in other companies, and it creates this ecosystem and sort of a positive cycle. And so that's what we're trying to do. I think we have made some progress in some of these cities, but I do think we need to continue to build on it. And the 37 different bills that have been proposed by this committee I've read through some of them, I think are steps in the right direction.
Thank you. Well, I've certainly seen that with the work of Startup Junkie and the incubator, small business incubators. The Kauffman Foundation's work has been dramatic, both in Fayetteville and in Little Rock, in creating an angel investor cohort and a startup environment. Mr. Newell, I want to conclude by just asking you to submit for the record your views on the lack of participation in the Reg A proposals from the work you did in Jobs Act and more bias towards Reg D. But I'm sorry, Mr. Trotter, but I'm going to yield back and call on the ranking member for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Case, I appreciate your leadership with the rise of the rest and your work during the Jobs Act. Through your investments across the country, you've been seeing firsthand what works for small businesses in underserved communities. Democrats on this committee have consistently delivered results for small businesses. During the pandemic, I worked with Ranking Member Velasquez to assure secure $60 billion in Paycheck Protection Program. That's the PPP program. Loans specifically for community financial institutions to reach small businesses left behind by big banks. We also worked with Republicans during Trump's first term to secure a historic $12 billion for community development financial institutions and minority depository institutions in 2020, which is projected to support more than $130 billion in new financing for underserved communities over the next decade. Additionally, committee Democrats worked with the Biden administration to renew the state small business credit initiative, which is already providing billions of dollars in new capital access for small businesses. As I said today and at the prior hearing, I look forward to working with Chairman Hill to advance sensible reforms that support small businesses and our public markets while keeping investors and consumers top of mind. Nevertheless, Mr. Case, no doubt you have seen reporting that the Trump-Musk administration is trying to shut down the Community Development Financial Institution Fund and the Minority Business Development Agency. Based on your extensive work with entrepreneurs in overlooked communities, what specific economic damage would occur if the current administration eliminates these and other small business support programs? Through your Rise of the Rest bus tour, I understand you have traveled 11,000 miles across the country. Which regions and demographics would be most severely impacted if these critical capital sources disappear? You know what the CDFI fund is.
Thank you, Ranking Member Waters, for your leadership on these issues over obviously a long period of time. And we have, with Rise of the Rest, traveled quite extensively around the country, and we've ended up making investments now in over 200 companies in over 100 different cities. So it is fairly broad. I think it's 38 states. So we have seen a lot. We've backed a lot of entrepreneurs, which is a reminder that there are great entrepreneurs building great companies everywhere. It just takes a little more effort to identify them and back them and mentor them and support them. In terms of your specific question, I'm on the side of more capital going to more entrepreneurs in more places, and programs like CDFI and others, I think, are helpful in that regard. I've not seen the specific proposals to modify that or change that, but in general, at this juncture, I think we need to be kind of reaching out, trying to level the playing field in as many ways as we can.
Okay, so if you don't really know what's going on with CDFI, if you find out that it's going to be eliminated, would you support CDFI?
I do support CDFI.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Trotter. Elon Musk is currently being sued by the Securities and Exchange Commission for allegedly swindling Twitter's investors of over $150 million and previously was penalized for $40 million for misleading Tesla investors. Now, through Doge, he potentially has access to the SEC's confidential information and have already demonstrated their utter disregard for data privacy, including gaining access to the data of Musk's competitors at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And also, it is alarming that Mr. Musk can even secure his own website, which has been hacked. The SEC possesses non-public information about pending IPOs, mergers, whistleblower complaints, and ongoing enforcement actions, including against Musk's own companies and competitors. You have long advised public and private companies that engage in capital raising activities. Could you discuss the sensitivity of the information shared with the SEC and what would happen if that information were to fall into the hands of competitors or leak prematurely into the markets? And could, for example, there be a conflict of interest with someone accessing the internal deliberations of the SEC if that person also has pending litigation? Mr. Trotter.
The SEC has in recent years been very focused on its own cybersecurity. One way in which I've seen as a practitioner, their approach has changed on confidential information that comes into the SEC, so the confidential treatment request process during SEC registration. The SEC has worked to make that self-executing so that information does not go to the SEC unless and until they request it. So that's one example that comes to mind when you raise this issue of cybersecurity at the agency.
Thank you, sir. Now we call on the gentleman from Michigan, the Vice Chair of the full committee, Mr. Huizenga, who's the sponsor of the Accredited Investor Definition Review Act and Improving Disclosures for Investors Act. Mr. Huizenga, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to echo a sentiment that I've heard from many already about that Congress should further expand the accredited investor definition to include a wider range of potential investors. According to the SEC, 19% of U.S. households qualify as under the definition of an accredited investor in 2022. 19%. That's locking out 81% of our population from ever having the opportunity to invest in those small businesses. And this was brought to really to the forefront. That we had a witness last Congress. Her name was Omi Bell, and if I recall, she was here from D.C., who founded an organization that assists African American female founders in securing funding to develop and grow their businesses. And Ms. Bell spoke about the challenges she faced as a young entrepreneur, receiving her first investment from her mother, who was not an accredited investor, and how updating that accredited investor definition would actually expand the opportunities for those businesses who are trying to raise capital. And I see Ms. Matthews-Burkeen nodding her head quite a bit. I'm going to go to you first then. How would expanding this accredited investor definition to include criteria besides wealth and income, how would that expand opportunities for both prospective investors and for those entrepreneurs, especially in those underrepresented communities?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, anyone over 18 can sports bet. They can go and play the lottery. They can go on to lots of apps and buy cryptocurrency with very little education. But what they can't do is go and invest in companies that have years and years of documentation and financials because they've been blocked out by rules and regulations against them. So what would that change? It would bring in new investors, new angel investors, because right now you have to have such an incredible amount of net worth. There are lots of people that work for my team that aren't able to be investors. They aren't accredited investors, but they know much more than the general American public.
So what you'll hear from critics of expanding this is that, well, see, there's not going to be any sort of safety net. There's not going to be any sort of review. These people are just, it's going to be caveat emptor. They're going to get hosed. We know it's going to be there, and it's only the federal government's definition of who should be investing that's saving them from themselves. Do you buy that?
I think that we could probably set a rule around the percentage of money that you're using every year. I think that could be fairly simple. That's something we could do for all of those things that I mentioned in the past.
So some reasonable things that are
Very reasonable.
And the assumption that bothers me, Mr. Chairman, is that if we were to change this federal definition of what an accredited investor is, that means there's no definition or no guardrails to any of this investing, which simply isn't the case. Mr. Trotter, I'm going to do a quick, actually, Mr. Case and Newell, if you could really super quickly answer this. I'm curious how current investor definition, as Ms. Matthews-Burkeen was talking about, how that really limits private capital for entrepreneurs, and what does that mean for for the economy and society?
Well, there are a lot of people who have ideas in terms of starting companies. Many don't have the commitment to follow through.
It's hard.
It's definitely very hard, and definitely you're risky, and you put your career often at risk. But there are many who I've found who do have the desire to go farther, but don't have access to the capital to get going. They don't have the money themselves. They don't necessarily have in their network friends and family who can write the checks, which is why it is so important to open it up. So yes, we need to protect people, but we also need to enable people who have ideas and want to pursue the American dream, start a company, to have a path to do that. And investors have a path to also invest. So it's not just essentially because of the current income rules, other rules related to credit investors, kind of the rich getting richer. How do we kind of level the playing field for investors as well?
That's a problem, the rich getting richer on this. Sorry, I've got 22 seconds left, and I have to move on to Mr. Trotter very quickly. Current law, issuers using Rule 506C are permitted to engage in general solicitation before filing a Form D, as long as they verify that all purchasers are accredited. If the SEC to mandate advance Form D filings before any general solicitation, how does that affect materially delaying capital raises and deter issuers like Angels List, Carta, others from using that Rule 506C?
Well, given the amount of time I'll just say it's not a good idea. I would not support it.
Okay, and maybe we can expand that in writing. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I
to do
appreciate
so.
it. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New York, the ranking member of the Small Business Committee, Ms. Vasquez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Matthews, I would like to remind you and everyone in this room that the funds-to-funds dynamic you're speaking so highly of was a proposal proposed and finalized by the SBA under the Biden administration, and I'm very proud to support it. I am the ranking member of the House Small Business Committee, as the chairman referred to. And I am here to tell you that expanding our private markets and engaging in private market offerings isn't the only way for small businesses to acquire equity capital. The SBA's SBIC program, as of 2024, have deployed more than $130 billion of capital to more than 194,000 small businesses. The CDFI Venture Capital Fund also responsibly invests equity capital to underserved and undercapitalized small businesses. Yet, the Trump administration's executive order does exactly the opposite. We need to be discussing ways to strengthen, not destroy, this type of programs. Ms. Sen, the title of today's hearing is Beyond Silicon Valley, Expanding Access to Capital Across America. While the title is certainly correct, the actions by the Trump administration and congressional Republicans tell a different story. President Trump recently issued the executive order that aims to curtail the non-statutory work of the CDFI program. If we are going to broaden the reach of capital beyond Silicon Valley, isn't this exactly the type of public-private program we should be promoting?
Thank you for the question. I am glad you guys included Alabama beyond Silicon Valley. You can't get much further. While our office does not directly administer CDFI programs, I did reach out both locally and nationally to my colleagues in banking and credit unions, and they discussed at length the impact that those programs have had on their communities. As a matter of fact, in Alabama alone, there are 10 CDFI credit unions. We're fairly rural, 40%, that serve over 300,000 members, supporting $2.9 billion in loans and $3.7 billion in deposits. They have extended nearly $18 million in total financial benefits to the underserved communities in Alabama. Our credit union friends are here, too, and they can provide further information to me if they'd like.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Sen, the U.S. capital markets have seen tremendous growth over the past decade, with a disproportionate share of the growth seen in private markets. Some of us are concerned that large private companies and private funds have misused securities exemptions to effectively stay private indefinitely, avoiding the transparency and accountability obligations to which many similarly situated public counterparts must adhere. Is this a concern you share?
It's a concern in every industry that some bad actor is going to exploit some opportunity to defraud somebody. We certainly see in Alabama, we have a law enforcement agency, and I'm mindful of the fact that I'm here for all 50 states, and I talk to my colleagues at least twice a week. And we do see fraudsters exploiting the Form D and the regulatory offerings, the forms that are provided to investors, and they use those to create an appearance of legitimacy at times. And so we want to preserve the integrity of those exemptions while also deterring fraud. And on the state level, y'all, we see so much, and we see the people that are engaged in the transactions within our borders, and it's so critically important because we're able to help prevent some of that. And those bad actors that are misusing those forms to defraud our Main Street and retail investors, we're in a position to be able to put a stop or at least deter that conduct.
Thank you. Thank you. And in your opinion, how do we appropriately balance the need for small businesses to have a less expensive method for raising equity capital through a private offering with the transparency needs of investors? Do you feel these balances are currently tailored appropriately?
We're always going to advocate for more investor protections. Exemptions are a privilege, and these businesses that are able to take advantage of it, it's because we believe that those mechanisms are trusted, or there's some oversight generally by another agency, for example, a banking authority. On a local level, though many of these opportunities are, at least on the Form D for the state side, in favor of the businesses. And just in Alabama as a reference, and I know my colleagues in other states, we offer programs to help small businesses get started. With our guidance on a state level, and we connect each other we have a huge networking, a huge network of resources in Alabama, but we're able to help them to build a foundation that enables them to be successful as they do continue to grow. And many of our communities, we are beyond Silicon Valley, y'all, but we have so many people that are excited about investing within their communities. And so we help at the Securities Commission facilitate those resources and get them on a good
Thank you,
level
Joe.
ground.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Like that y'all, like the Alabama accent. I can understand it. Mr. Sessions from Texas, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, thank you very much. Chairman Case and Ms. Bracken, I'm going to primarily ask your opinion in just a few minutes. The entire panel here is champions of capitalism, and this committee appreciates and respects not only the words that you bring to us, but really the ideas about us getting stronger. I note, Chairman Case, in your conversation with the committee, in your testimony, you talk about a Texas company, Androl, that added 4,000 jobs because you got in and became an investor and helped them. I also note that in your testimony, Chairman Case, you talk about 75% of venture capital flowed to 3 states, California, Massachusetts, and New York, with 47 states left to share the remaining 25%. And your data is up to last year, 2024, which means that it would be current. I want to ask your opinion about the things that we have been attempting to do to meet the challenge in Texas. We know that we have enormous growth and opportunity, that we have to meet the challenge in Texas, not only from the promise of these companies, whether it be large data centers, chip manufacturers, that probably already have the funding that or sources that they need, but maybe the hundreds of small companies that might be suppliers and add to that robust development. Our governor, Greg Abbott, has convened 2 champions of capitalism and influence in the state of Texas, Ross Perot Jr. and Harlan Crow, both of Dallas, Texas. And they have started a Strategic Texas Fund. It has the balance of the support of government through the governor of the state of Texas, and then the entrepreneur leaders. We've always heard if business leaders lead, others can follow. Can both of you take in the 2 minutes and 40 seconds left and give us perhaps a 1-minute analysis about things that you've learned about doing this that may help them be successful, things that might be important for me as a member, and give us your viewpoint about Texas trying to break into that outside of the 25% with 47 other states. Chairman Case?
Sure. First of all, thank you for the question and the insights around what's happening in Texas. We've now done a number of things, investing in a number of different cities in Texas, and there is a lot of momentum, but there's still a lot of work to do. I think the last number I recall seeing is the state of Texas, which, as you know, is a pretty big state with pretty big cities, was getting somewhere between 2 and 3% of venture capital. California was getting over 50%. The reason for that is because you create this positive cycle I talked about earlier. People want to be there, so people move there. The investment and backs companies there. The success of those companies then ripples through the economy there. They saw this even in Northern Virginia. AOL started in Tyson's Corner, Virginia. When we went public in 1992, that created kind of wealth in the community. You saw the benefits of that backing other startups in the the corridor towards Dulles Airport. So momentum begets momentum, and the leadership of people in the community, successful entrepreneurs, successful business leaders, is very important. Actually, when we were there with our Rise of the Rest bus in Texas, Harlan Crow hosted us for an event, and we've also spent time with Ross Perot Jr. People like that stepping up to say we need to do more to support entrepreneurs in our communities. We don't want them to leave to go someplace else. We want them to stay, and if they did leave, we want them to come back. And we want to create a sense of possibility in our community so people really do believe they can start and scale a significant company here.
Thank you. Ms. Bracken?
Yeah, in the state of Ohio, we've done the same thing, public-private partnerships to help our venture capital industry grow. So firstly, through Ohio Third Frontier, that helped to seed multiple funds around the state, part of it being seeded by SSBCI more than 10 years ago. We've also launched a new fund, the Ohio Fund, which is kind of just what you're talking about in Texas, primarily focused in our state, bringing together lots of our larger research and development organizations around the state and seeding lots of new funds and new innovations. We also have an Ohio Growth Fund that's funded by Jobs Ohio. That comes from a bond issue as well as dollars that come in from Ohio Liquor and beyond. So that is a way for our state to kind of create new jobs, bring in new revenue, and attract new dollars into the state and really spur growth.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, it's my hope that every member of this committee will listen and learn that economic growth and development is good for their people back home, that capitalism works, and we're at a time now that can be a golden age for America. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Sessions. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, the ranking member of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes.
Ms. Bracken, I think you're right that FDIC insurance limit ought to be higher for, at least for checking accounts that are used for operations by small business. Mr. Trotter, you tell us that we can rely on these anti-fraud provisions, but we're offering $50,000 buyout for every SEC employee that enforces those provisions. Then we're closing all the regional offices, including the one in Los Angeles, that enforces those provisions. We can't relax the rules in reliance on the basic anti-fraud provisions if we won't enforce the anti-fraud provisions. Crime in the suites will grow if we follow the rule of Doge and defund the police. Mr. Huizenga, you're right, the accredited investor definition is crazy. It's based on the idea, several ideas, each of which are stupid. One is that a couple with $300,000 is rich, $300,000 income. And second, that rich people should be the ones that are accredited. We should, as Ms. Bracken points out, look at the percentage of the assets that the person is investing in that investment, and perhaps in all private offerings combined. And I think, Mr. Huizenga, there are a number of bills that look at what knowledge the investor has, and we ought to look at the truly independent advisors available to the investor. Another definition that we have that makes no sense is that we say that you become a public company when you have 2,000 holders of record. Okay, 2,000 investors, that's a public company. But in counting to 2,000, we count all Merrill Lynch customers as one. I'm a Merrill Lynch customer. They got thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. I haven't met them. They're not part of my family. And yet, when we add, so we have this weird math where 2,000 can mean 200,000. One of our witnesses says that when you make an accredited investment, you have years and years of financial information, sometimes, but not necessarily. Look, I've been on the business side of this, helping companies raise capital. Back in last century, I realized every investor protection is experienced by the business people involved as a hassle and a barrier. But if we don't have investor protections, we won't have vibrant capital markets. And if capitalism worked best without investor protections, then Uzbekistan, with no capital investor protections, would be doing better than Wall Street. I want to thank Chairman Hill for including in the list of bills that we're dealing with today the Access to Small Business Investor Capital Act. I introduced this bill in the 116th, 117th, 118th, and now the 119th Congress. I believe the fourth time is the charm. I'm honored to be joined by Mr. Huizinga and Mr. Garbiano and Ms. Bynum in that effort. Mr. Trotter, why is it important that we have vibrant BDCs and that we not have this peculiar provision in calculating their expenses that keeps them out of the indexes?
Well, that's my area of focus is really on corporation finance and the part of the SEC that registers IPOs, and I don't really have much to say about that question. Okay. If I may, I would say on your enforcement question, the private securities litigation is very active.
I recognize that, but an awful lot of times the person you're suing is bankrupt. We really need, but you know, certainly by the time you get the private securities regulation. And Mr. Trotter, what do we do so that we have public and private capital markets at every stage? Is private capital part of that effort?
I would say absolutely yes. Private capital is certainly a part of that effort. I think Regulation D is an important part of that regulation environment. One other thing is on your issue of a major broker-dealer counting as one holder of record. That really only happens once a company has already gone public, and that method of counting usually doesn't come into play.
I would disagree with you, and look forward to talking to you about it.
Sure.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Oklahoma, the chairman of the Task Force on Monetary Policy, Mr. Lucas, is recognized for 5 minutes, and he's also the sponsor of H.R. 1013, the Retirement Fairness for Charity and Educational Institutions Act.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses today. And I, too, want to express my appreciation for the chairman for attaching that very bill, the Fairness Retirement Act for Charities and Educational Institutions Act, to this hearing. My bill would allow teachers, charity workers, and other nonprofit employees participating in 403B retirement plans access to the same investments available to workers with 401K plans or 457B plans. This bipartisan bill provides fairness investment opportunities for nonprofit employees, so I'm glad to see that notice today. Shifting my focus, I'd like to discuss the disturbing trend we've seen in recent decades of fewer and fewer companies entering public markets. When I came to Congress, there were over 8,000 public company listings in the United States. Today, there are fewer than 4,000. Healthy public markets allow companies to receive lower cost funding while giving investors opportunities to deploy their capital and seek a return. We should make sure our companies have the option to go and stay public without burdensome prohibitive regulations. Mr. Trotter, can you talk about the regulatory barriers that companies face when looking to raise capital through public markets?
Well, they are extensive, and again, I think one of the big problems in this area is that if you think of how total market capitalization is distributed, you have fully half of U.S. market cap represented by about 50 companies. If you extend it to the largest 500, that's the vast majority of market capitalization. And you have regulations that are designed to apply to all public companies as if they are each the same size. They're simply not. So the great thing about the Jobs Act and the emerging growth company definition was to provide that kind of on-ramp relief, which should be extended.
Thank you. All of those barriers that you mentioned are particularly challenging for businesses who don't have access to all this capital early on, or for those with high input costs like ag and energy in my home state. This is also a challenge in our private markets. If you can't raise Series A capital, it's difficult to secure Series B or C or D funding. Private markets have experienced sustained growth for the past decade, but that growth is concentrated in places like California and New York. Ms. Bracken, why is it important that private markets are accessed in geographically diverse areas? Why do we all need to be able to tap these resources?
Yeah, I'm actually going to answer that by also saying, 44% of our kind of U.S. economy is generated by small businesses, right? So these tech companies are those companies. If we are concentrating all of the capital in 3 major cities, as Mr. Case said, then we can't grow businesses. Not all businesses are started in a garage. Some of them are started in laboratories. One of those was an antihistamine at the University of Cincinnati, and they made Benadryl. Those things are made other places, and we have to have the capital to put into those firms.
Mr. Case, would you like to comment on that as well? Why is it important that companies across a broad array of diverse experiences and industries have access to funding, not just those with Ivy League founders?
Well, for a couple of reasons. One is, as we've all been discussing, and you well know, these new companies, these startups, are the big job creators, the big economic drivers. So we have that only happening in a few places. We don't have a diverse innovation economy. We have a lot of communities that feel like they're being left behind. We have a lot of communities where they're seeing job loss due to disruption without getting any of the job gains that can also come from new companies. So that's a key part of it. Another key part of it, though, is entrepreneurs fundamentally see a problem and decide to do something about it, create a company to do something about it. The problems you see in rural America are different than the problems you see in New York City, for example. So in the area of agriculture technology, ag tech, you're likely to find an entrepreneur with an insight into the future of farming in Nebraska more than you are in Silicon Valley. And so we need to make sure we get all those ideas on the table. We have more shots on goal, if you will, as a country, and that requires getting more people from more places into the innovation economy.
Clearly, we need to modernize our security laws with incremental reforms to make capital formation through public and private marketplace attractive to business, all types, all sizes, all locations. Thank you for this very important hearing, today, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts, the ranking member of the Digital Assets, Financial Technology, and Artificial Intelligence Subcommittee. Mr. Lynch, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member, and thank you to our witnesses for your willingness to help this committee with its work. You know, when I talk to most business leaders today in the current environment, I find that the greatest obstacle that they talk about to capital formation and launching new development is actually President Donald Trump and his $1.4 trillion in chaotic on-again, off-again tariffs and on steel, on aluminum, on lumber. And as a former construction manager, it makes it very, very difficult for banks and finance companies to quantify risk on a loan when you've got this threat out there of 25 to 50% tariffs on some of these basic building products, and creates a lot of uncertainty, which is problematic in lending. Mr. Case, do you agree this uncertainty is a problem?
Yes, I think business looks for clarity and uncertainty, and when there is confusion,
Thank you. That's
they
all I
are
need.
less likely to invest.
All right, yeah, there you go. Thank you, I appreciate that. And as far as private versus public markets, I got some data here from Citizens Bank. Since 2001, the number of private equity-backed companies grew from 2,000 U.S. companies to 11,500 companies. On the other hand, and that's a 400% increase, on the other hand, at the same time, the number of publicly listed companies declined sharply from 7,000 to only 4,500. Director Sen, while 9 out of 10 new ventures fail, pension funds seem to be, 2/3 of new private equity investments come from pension funds. 30% of hedge funds investors and 23% of venture capital investors are pension funds. This means that a substantial portion of pension funds, retirement savings of teachers, firefighters, police officers, nurses, government employees, construction workers, and other Main Street middle-class folks are invested in private funds. And I understand the mix that pension fund managers are seeking, and I understand they're searching for yield. But why is it important that we maintain adequate regulatory requirements to keep investors safe? And could lowering requirements like changing the accredited investor definition endanger pension funds and other investors?
Based on the information you provided from Citizens Bank, it sounds like our private marketers are doing exceptionally well with the funding that they have now.
Right.
The states do support modifications, some reforms to the accredited investor definition, but what we're asking for is also disclosures, more transparent disclosures on these private offerings. The public markets are out there for the entire world to see all of their financial records, and people are able to scrutinize them across the globe. And so with the private markets, it's important for all investors. I know some of these are high-risk businesses that are given access to retail, not just retail given access to the high-risk businesses. Many of them are startups, nascent stage, but having those disclosures on the other side as well are critically important to allowing these people to invest, and mitigate the risk.
So that shift of investment, the flow of investment to private equity, there's a lack of transparency on that side when compared to public companies. Is that right?
It is a more opaque market than the public market, certainly, because all of the filings are out there for the world to see. On the private side, what we see, and this is, I emphasize again the state's roles in all of this, especially the smaller businesses and smaller offerings. When you have somebody within the state, within those local markets, helping review documents with these companies that are getting off the ground, this information, financials aren't available to everybody. Business plans aren't available. They're filed confidentially with us. And so investors don't have as much information, near the information they have as they do with public companies.
One incident that we were faced with last year was when Silicon Valley Bank failed. When we looked at the list of investors in that company, CalPERS, California Pension Fund, was a significant investor. So it just, do you have any thoughts on that?
Pension, I know in Alabama we do have a pension fund, and we have a phenomenal team of advisors that do a great job of keeping that fund healthy. So, pension fund, they can weigh their own respective risks, but I know each state has an opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Missouri, the chair of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, Ms. Wagner, Missouri. She's sponsoring, attached to this hearing, the Small Entity Update Act, the Encouraging Public Offerings Act, the Increasing Investor Opportunities Act, and the Developing and Empowering Our Aspiring Leaders Act, the DEAL Act. Ms. Wagner, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Case, I'm going to get right to it here. You've spent years championing entrepreneurship beyond Silicon Valley through the RISE and REST Fund. Can you explain why current capital formation policies are failing entrepreneurs in rural areas and how the proposed reforms could change that?
Thank you for your question, and we have had great success across the country, including Missouri. One of the companies we backed in St. Louis, Somersault, is doing extremely well. The challenge for entrepreneurs in these Rise of the Rest cities, in these places outside of the major coastal tech hubs, is they generally don't have access to the capital they need to get started. They don't have the friends and family, and there's not enough local venture funds to really give them that first start. And then as they expand, they don't have the capital they need to grow the company. So creating more opportunities for more entrepreneurs in more parts of the country to get that initial capital is critically important. And the kind of things this committee is discussing, including making it easier for accredited investors and encouraging more angel investors and supporting, as I mentioned in my testimony, the 1,400 regional funds that have started in the next 10 years. How do we make sure the majority of those go forward, and ways to make it easier for them to raise capital so they can then invest that capital in entrepreneurs in their backyard.
And to that point, Mr. Case, venture capital networks are often built on elite university ties and personal relationships. How could allowing larger VC funds to invest in smaller regional funds help break down these barriers and distribute capital to more areas of the country?
I agree with your hypothesis that in places like Silicon Valley, it's obviously a very robust, very successful ecosystem. but often it is sort of insular, or maybe even a little bit elite, and they're generally focused on backing entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley that came from Stanford or worked at Google or some other company. And so getting some of that capital focused on other parts of the country is important. And as you say, making it easier for them to invest in some of these regional funds, to support those funds, but also to have some insights into what's happening in those markets, some deal flow. Some of those small companies may then expand and need the capital that they could then use their core funds for.
And allowing a fund investment into these smaller firms wouldn't just benefit the venture capital firms and their investors, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and what would the impact be on the underfunded startups throughout the country?
More capital going to more entrepreneurs in more places will then result in more companies starting, more of them getting to the point where they're scaling and can be successful, which will drive, obviously, job growth and economic growth.
Mr. Cates, according to the SEC Small Business Advocate, Rule 506C, as created by the Jobs Act, is disproportionately used by first-time and diverse fund managers because it allows issuers to broadly solicit and advertise an offering. Do you see a risk that an advanced Form D filing requirement could create hesitation among entrepreneurs and fund managers toward using this exemption out of concern they might inadvertently run afoul of technical requirements?
I think that is a concern. I did work on the Jobs Act more than a decade ago, and it was, as I said in my testimony, I was delighted that it passed, but also delighted it passed in a bipartisan way. And I think it did strike the right balance in terms of enabling good things to happen while also protecting from bad things from happening. And continuing to strike that balance is obviously critically important.
Ms. Matthews-Brackeen, what would be the real-world impact on founders, particularly underrepresented ones, if general solicitations had to be delayed due to a pre-filed Form D requirement? And what would that chill the use of the exemption entirely?
Yes, it would have a chilling effect. I don't see a reason to file a form before you've gotten it done. It just would create another barrier that is completely unnecessary.
I would tend to agree. Mr. Trotter, many retail investors lack access to high-growth private companies because they're not accredited. We've talked about this, I'm sure. Would lifting the cap on private investments within closed-end funds provide a practical, regulated pathway for broader retail exposure to private markets without undermining investor protection?
Yes, I think that's a fair inference and a sensible approach.
Great, thank you. I think we are all in agreement. I appreciate you all being here, and we look forward to, we've got up to 40 capital formation bills that the Capital Markets Committee is advancing, and I look forward to getting to a markup so that we can advance those to the floor and hopefully get some support in the Senate too. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the chairwoman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, the ranking member of our Housing and Insurance Subcommittee, Mr. Cleaver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Finn, I don't know, maybe you or some of the other panelists are familiar with the butterfly effect, that a little butterfly could light on your shoulder and you take a bad step and the bad step causes you to fall and you fall and tear an ACL and then you have to go to the hospital, and it goes on. And essentially, the butterfly effect is that something seemingly inconsequential can happen, but it could have significant impacts along the way. The butterfly effect. And on March 14th of this year, the President issued an executive order entitled Continuing the Reduction of the Federal Bureaucracy, in which the President declared that certain agencies are part of the federal bureaucracy that is, and I quote, unnecessary, unquote, and the EO eliminates non-statutory functions and reduces the statutory functions of agencies that the President calls unnecessary governmental entities. That's seemingly, just something happens and they barely mention it on the news, But one of those impacted agencies was the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. And all of us, my experiences in life impacts, my present attitude and my views. And so I am convinced that maybe in second and third place, the most significant domestic challenge we have is housing, accommodating the people of this country in affordable and decent housing. And one of the problems that move by the president had is that it impacts the MBDA, the Minority Business Development Agency, and it also impacts the CDFI fund. I represent an area, an urban area mainly, and this is going to help devastate an already devastating problem impacting the country. Can you or somebody tell me how we get rid of this? How can we undo the butterfly effect? Is it possible? This is in the real world, not the political world where people try to, say something to hurt somebody else. This is a real problem. Can anybody help me?
Congressman, I'm not sure if we can undo it, but as I said earlier, if 44% of the U.S. economy is generated by small business, we wouldn't get rid of funding for farmers because we need to eat, and we wouldn't get rid of funding for the military because we need to keep each other safe, and we shouldn't make it more difficult to run a small business in the middle of America, because that is how we drive the American economy. So how do we undo it? It's with conversations like this and making certain that we don't defund the things that are running the U.S. economy.
Anybody else agree with that?
I do agree with that, and I also would echo what you said around the housing situation, that I think it's a national challenge to build more homes for more people at different price points and with an eye towards affordability, and that there's much that can be done at the federal level and a lot that can be done at the local and state level to unleash really a revolution in housing. I think the last several decades, we have not really seen the innovation in that sector that's critically necessary. And there's a mix of things. Some of it is regulatory policy, including some of the things at the local level. Some of it is innovations around construction technologies. But we've got to figure out ways to get more people in homes and get the affordability down. That's an issue in almost every part of this country.
Yeah, I'll just add that as 40% rural state here in Alabama, and our colleagues, we are boots on the ground. These people are in our backyards. We see them, across our communities. And so by helping empower and grow our small businesses, they can create jobs within our states, and we're able to do that. With regard to your CDFI statement, I've talked with our local banks and credit unions, and they have very much so experienced the impact in those communities, especially in rural Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Cleaver. Gentleman from Kentucky, the chairman of the Financial Institutions Subcommittee, Mr. Barr, is recognized. He's the author of the Small Business Investor Capital Access Act. Mr. Barr, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me, Mr. Case. Excessive compliance burdens should not prevent the flow of capital into Main Street businesses, the driver of economic growth in our country. And your testimony that roughly 75% of venture capital flowed to just 3 states, California, Massachusetts, and New York, with 47 states left to share the remaining 25%. That's alarming. It's alarming for Kentucky startups that in flyover country don't have access to capital. The Private Fund Investment Registration Act of 2010 exempts private fund investors with less than $150 million in assets under management from SEC registration, but that requirement has not been changed in 15 years since it was enacted. So as the chairman pointed out, I introduced the Small Business Investor Capital Act to address that issue, adjust it for inflation. Would tying the exemption threshold for certain private fund advisors to inflation help right-size regulation for smaller funds?
Yes, I believe it would be a step in the right direction. More capital going to more entrepreneurs and more places, I think, will be helpful to those communities and helpful to the country.
And talk a little bit more, and you've already answered my colleagues' questions about this, but what are some of the things we can do to build on the Jobs Act to attract more capital to those other 47 states like Kentucky, where you do have startups that don't have access to a lot of capital? We have, a few private equity firms that focus on manufacturing. That's great, but doesn't really address those venture stage firms. We have a Bluegrass Angels group that does great stuff helping commercialization out of the University of Kentucky. What are some of the things that we can do to add to the Jobs Act to attract capital to those startups in places like Kentucky?
I'd say mixed news on this front. The big data in terms of how much capital is going to the 47 states, the 25%, is still a little bit troubling, a little bit sobering. At the same time, over the last decade, 1,400 new venture firms have started in different parts of the country. So part of the challenge is how do you get more funds like that, and how do you maximize the number of those funds to succeed to their second fund and their third fund? Opening up more groups of investors, including modifying the accredited investor language and rules, would be helpful in that regard. Anything that can get more capital into more fund managers in these communities, because they're much likelier to find the entrepreneurs in their own backyard, back those entrepreneurs, mentor those entrepreneurs, and then when they scale, connect them to other entrepreneurs in other regions, other parts of the country. It really has to start locally. If people can't raise that capital locally, they often decide they have to move to the coast, places like Silicon Valley, to really have a shot at the American dream.
Well, thank you for that testimony. And Mrs. Matthews-Brackeen, I want to ask you about the SBIC licensing process and the experience you had with Lightship. We have some folks in Kentucky who want to start SBICs. They have private capital to help put up, but the licensing process seems to be very cumbersome at the SBA. And, when you talk about getting capital to parts of the country that need it and don't have it, this is a big impediment at the Small Business Administration. Do you think that the licensing process is a barrier to new SBICs being formed in the heartland of our country? I am told by some of these folks that want to start an SBIC that it's like a black box over there. People apply and then hear nothing until they do. It could be months and months before they even get a response on whether their application has any issues.
I would say that we had the opposite situation. I feel as if there was a lot of transparency around the process from start to finish, from deadlines to when we would hear back on certain portions of the application. It is an arduous process. There are FBI background checks. There are background checks with lots of different people. But I will say, step by step, that SBIC team was equipped to say yes if they could, if we had the experience necessary.
Well, my experience with my constituents is that you have to have experience with an SBIC in order to be approved, and it's a chicken or the egg. How are we going to get more SBICs if the SBA won't approve them for people who have never done them before? So we need to work on that with Administrator Loeffler. Finally, a quick question for Mr. Trotter. I introduced the Regulation Advancement for Capital Enhancement Act that would streamline Reg A, reducing the waiting period for offering statements filed with the SEC under Reg A, expediting small and medium enterprises like in the horse racing industry, innovative companies that securitize thoroughbred racehorses, democratizing racehorses, horse racing so that all Americans can invest in helping capital formation. When done in a manner that maintains robust investor protection, Mr. Trotter, what are the benefits of streamlining SEC filings under Reg A?
Well, I think your proposal is a great step in the right direction. The difficulty in my mind with Reg A has always been not necessarily the limitation on the amount that you can offer, although that's certainly a factor. The difficulty is that to do a Reg A offering, you're doing almost all of the work of a regular way IPO. And so if you're going to do almost all of that work, you might as well do a little extra work and have a real IPO. So that's the challenge that Reg A has always faced in my experience.
Thanks, Mr. Trotter.
Thank you. I yield.
Thank you, Chairman Barr. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Dr. Foster, the ranking member of our Financial Institutions Subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess I'd like to start by congratulating the Trump administration on delivering it from its campaign promise of using technology to make the most transparent administration ever. That they're really doing very well on that. And I want to say a little bit about trying to get geographic diversity into investments and because, I guess I have a little bit of seniority on Mr. Case, since it was 5 decades ago that I started my company with my little brother and $500 from my parents, that now manufactures the majority of the theater lighting equipment in the U.S., about 1,500 employees. We manufacture in Middleton, Wisconsin and Mazomanie, Wisconsin, and you're forgiven if you don't know those. But it strikes me that there are 2 barriers to trying to make businesses work in the heartland. One of them is capital, which we've discussed a lot. The other one is access to people. And that depends a lot on the nature of the business. If you're trying to scale a chain of donut stores, you have all the people you need in any city in the United States. If it's a really high-tech firm, then there's trouble because you often have to recruit both spouses. And this is a classic problem. It's called the two-body problem in academics, and it's a huge thing. If you're trying to, you have a top-of-the-line software developer or a biotech person, you can get them to move to Chicago or to Madison or to Austin. You can't get them to move to Dixon, Illinois. And it's a huge problem. Mr. Case, you've been struggling with this, and I think that's part of the reason why we've made so little progress on this. What's your thinking on that second barrier?
No, I totally agree with your assessment. Capital is important, but in some ways, talent is more important. You need the talent to get started. You need the talent to scale, and it's more difficult to get that talent in certain parts of the country. We have seen examples of successes, including in Illinois, cities like Chicago, bigger cities have backed companies.
Oh yeah, Chicago's been the number one.
But even I was going to say, as you well know, in normal Bloomington, Rivian has done quite well in scaling quite rapidly. So you need to find the opportunity that leads people to not want to leave and that creates a boomerang of people who want to return because they really believe that that's happening. And then you start building that ecosystem and leveraging the national labs, which are spread around the country, and the research universities that are spread around the country. One company we backed in Atlanta called Hermie is working on Mach 5 engine is in Atlanta because Georgia Tech is turning into a feeder of talent, young engineers and others who can be part of that. So the talent exists in these cities. It then tends to go to the coast. We need to keep more of that from leaving and get more of it to return.
Yeah, well, I think we should just pay more attention to that second issue and understand if that's something that can really be overcome or just something we ought to design around. Now, in the issue of accredited investors, it strikes me that there's sort of 2 dimensions here, one of which is the wealth, the ability to bear losses, and that's important. The other one is the knowledge, and it strikes me there are multiple dimensions to that knowledge test. Because there's the knowledge of just the nature of investment, and there's a big spread in the sophistication of investors. There's the accuracy of the auditing of the financials, all right? And then there's the understanding of the actual business model. And so, Mr. Newell, in the history of your company that you went through in your testimony, you had very sophisticated initial investors from which you raised the first couple $100 million, and then you went public, and then you described a big bubble in the valuation when a bunch of frankly dumb money came. You were sitting around during COVID, sitting on the couch saying, "Biotech's interesting. I'll invest in biotech firms." And I imagine most of those public investors didn't know the difference between antibody drug conjugate and a hole in the ground, but they just wanted to invest in biotech. And most of those investors, the money they put in has been wiped out because now, the sophisticated investors know you were doing something that had a low probability of success and a huge payout, and they provided a valuation. The public investors had no idea. And so I was just wondering, is there a reason why we should maybe look at that second dimension of the sector that you're investing in and have different thresholds in different sectors so that a chain of donut shops have a very low threshold because everyone can understand it, and for complex sectors, maybe a different set of qualifications?
Congressman, thank you very much for that question, and I think that's an astute observation. The biotechnology industry, which I've been in for over 25 years, was not something that came to me naturally because I did not take science in school. So I had to learn progressively, year over year, what the industry is about, what the science is about. already had the business fundamentals because of my background as a corporate lawyer. So I understood the business aspect of it. And it is a unique issue where you see in the capital markets, public, people who don't know anything can invest, but in the private markets, people who don't know anything can invest if they have a lot of money.
I'm afraid my time is up, but if any of you have thoughts on that, about having sort of different thresholds for different sectors based on the complexity, I'd be interested in hearing.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you so much, Dr. Foster. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, the chairman of our Small Business Committee, Mr. Williams, who's also the author of Expands Protections for Research reports covering all securities of all issuers. Mr. Williams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for being here today. And the Jobs Act made it easier for broker-dealers to issue reports about small growing companies planning to go public by exempting these reports from being treated as an offer to sell securities. This exemption has been instrumental in facilitating access to research coverage for small and emerging companies, helping them attract investor interest in the IPO process. However, the current provision is limited to emerging growth companies, leaving out a vast number of potential issuers who could also benefit from increased transparency and market insight. My bill would expand the research report exemption to include reports about any issuer that undertakes a proposed public offering of securities. This would enhance market efficiency, providing investors with more comprehensive information, ultimately helping to level the playing field. Mr. Trotter, could you explain how such an expansion would benefit the marketplace without compromising investor protection, especially as research analysis remain subject to robust SEC and FINRA regulations?
Yes, this is a perfect example of how the IPO on-ramp provisions can be extended. So you're building on an existing exemption that's available for emerging growth companies relating to their equity securities. Your bill would expand that to all companies, regardless of their size, regardless of whether they're emerging growth companies, larger companies, and would apply not only to equity securities, but also to debt securities. We have 13 years of experience with the exemption. It's been very helpful for emerging growth companies to have uninterrupted research written on their companies, and it would be beneficial for all companies to benefit from that as well. It's also based on an SEC rule that's a little bit more limited than your provision, but your provision would be very helpful.
Okay, thank you. Access to capital remains a critical challenge for many small businesses across the country, particularly those in rural areas. And I represent a lot of rural area in Texas. And many rural entrepreneurs are still struggling to secure funding they need to grow and survive, primarily because of regulatory and compliance burdens. Despite the legislative efforts to ease these barriers, there are still significant gaps when it comes to ensuring small rural businesses have plenty of options to access crucial capital. So, Ms. Matthews-Brackeen, can you elaborate on what challenges rural small businesses are currently facing in assessing capital?
Absolutely. We service lots of entrepreneurs and founders around the state of Ohio, especially in rural areas. The capital isn't there. They're many times having to leave their cities or enter programs that are offered by our state or the federal government so that they can access capital. It's incredibly difficult, but it is possible. We've met people in Youngstown, Ohio, building $14 million companies. But it's possible, but incredibly difficult. So I think if left to our own devices, capital markets are really going to go to concentrated areas here in the country, and those people will be left out.
Okay. Now, small businesses are facing an increasingly difficult environment when it comes to securing capital, as we've talked about, particularly given the rise in regulatory compliance costs, the concentration of venture capital funding in states like California, New York, and Massachusetts. And for the lack of capital, or for many small businesses, outside of these traditional investment hubs, the lack of capital resources and difficulty of meeting regulatory requirements creates significant obstacles to growth and sustainability. This situation not only limits the small business growth potential, but also hampers economic development in communities that could greatly benefit from entrepreneurial investment. So, Mr. Case, from your experience, would any of the capital formation policies discussed today make it easier for unrepresented entrepreneurs or those from flyover states to raise capital?
Yes, it's always going to be a challenge to start a company anywhere. It's a bigger challenge if you're not in one of the major coastal tech hubs. And the legislation that's been being considered by this committee will be a step in the right direction to make it a little bit easier for entrepreneurs in places that aren't where most of the capital is right now to have access to capital to get started and to scale their businesses. So I think that there's some constructive conversation. I haven't read every single one of the 37 bills that have been proposed, but what the summaries I've read have been, I think, helpful and build on the work of the Jobs Act more than a decade ago.
All right. Thank you very much, and Mr. Chairman, I yield my time back.
Gentleman yields back. Chairman recognizes the gentleman from California, the ranking member on our task force on monetary policy, Mr. Vargas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I appreciate very much this hearing. I want to thank all of the witnesses here today. I have 2 lines of questioning today. I would like to ask about risk and investors' protection, and also about the diversity of access to capital around the country. Mr. Trotter, I'm welcome back, by the way. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
I'm tempted to give you more time to answer the ranking member's question on Elon Musk's conflict of interest, but I think I'll skip that one for you, give you a break. But I do want to ask about this. On page 3 of your testimony, and also your testimony today, you say a few things. None of the proposals would alter any of the robust anti-fraud provisions of the federal securities laws. And then you go on to the 2 key proposals. On the list of proposals, 2 are by far the most important: extending the IPO on-ramp based on 13 years of successful experience, just talked about that, and expanding eligibility for well-known seasoned insurers status based on decades of successful experience. So we had to have some, and you did mention the 50 largest companies, the 500 largest companies, the market cap that they control. So how do you protect, and I do agree with much of what's been said, but how do you make sure that these small investors, these new people coming into the market, don't get screwed?
Again, I would begin with the anti-fraud provisions of the federal securities laws, which are very rigorously enforced by the private securities bar, frankly. So class action litigation is a real thing. When your stock drops significantly, you do get sued.
We had Bill Larack in San Diego. I'm very familiar with that.
Yeah.
You get Laracked.
So that is by far and away the most significant source of discipline in our capital markets. And none of these provisions before you, just like the Jobs Act, alter the liability matrix under the 34 Act or the 33 Act. There's very robust.
But giving more time, I mean, you talk about the 404B, that you don't have the independent auditor. Give them a little more time, for these small companies, the on-ramp. I mean, how does that not create more risk?
Yeah. So 404B is an internal controls audit. It's separate and apart from the financial statements audit. Every public company has an independent auditor that's PCAOB registered, every single one. The Jobs Act did not change that. The Jobs Act extended an on-ramp that already existed under SEC regulations for new public companies that got a little more time before they had to do 404B compliance. And again, my point on that is it is directly targeting the top of the market, the high-end,
just scaling,
largest,
basically.
exactly,
Scaling
scaling the
that
regulatory burden.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Case, you're talking about diversity of, access to capital and entrepreneurship, and thank you again for your efforts. One of the things you didn't talk about, or we talked about briefly here, is housing. I asked AI, what is the price differential in homes from Silicon Valley and Arkansas? In Silicon Valley, it's over $2 million now. In Arkansas, it's $299,500. I mean, it seems to have a natural, opportunity there in Arkansas versus Silicon Valley. So why don't you just have naturally reoccurring or the occurrence of these investments in places where people can afford to live?
Well, I do think there are some significant cost of living advantages in many parts of the country, including as you mentioned, in Arkansas. And that is one of the reasons people might consider staying where they are or moving back to some place. But you still need to have that innovation engine in that community. You still need to have enough startups, enough critical mass to be able to have venture funds, have enough venture fund success so you can do kind of follow-on investing, which then leaves people growing up there or going to school there to stay there, and maybe even some of the people who left for what they thought were greener pastures to return. And so there are huge advantages all across the country in terms of the cost of living, cost of doing business, huge advantage in terms of understanding some of the legacy industries. Now that we're moving into the third wave of the internet, agriculture and many other sectors are being reimagined, manufacturing is being reimagined. The skill set around that does exist for the most part.
One of the things that you didn't talk about, though, is cultural also. It's interesting that on the coast that everybody likes to beat up on. I live on the coast I live in San Diego. We are rather progressive in how we look at young entrepreneurs. And also, you know, we have different types of entrepreneurs. You have a lot of people from different countries that are come to our, you know, our state, and we don't discriminate. Our gross state product now is over $4 trillion. It's the 5th largest economy in the world if it was a country. And you go to some of these other states, they don't want immigrants. You know, they beat up on them all the time. These universities, they go after them. They make fun of Ivy Leaguers here. And all of a sudden say, well, why don't these young, smart kids come to these states? Well, I wonder why. Anyway, with that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here to discuss this important topic. And Mr. Trotter, I want to ask you about the decline in initial public offerings over the past decades. You know, as you've mentioned, while the Jobs Act of 2012 helped lower IPO barriers from a compliance perspective, and we've seen some recovery in the IPO market driven by large companies, small companies continue to see a decline in IPO activity. To what extent is the underwriting cost for IPOs a barrier to entry for would-be public companies?
Well, my focus is on the regulatory burden, which I think is very significant. And I think Mr. Newell hit it on the head when he said that the easiest way to fix this is to extend that IPO on-ramp concept that we already have.
Okay, and you brought up the regulatory burdens, and how have they reduced a new company's willingness to help take smaller companies public, or underwriters to take small companies public?
Sure, well, by reducing the regulatory burdens associated with going public, and then by extending the regulatory relief that you get as a new public company, you make the whole process more streamlined.
Okay. My understanding, underwriting fees are the largest single direct cost associated with an IPO. Has the current regulatory environment driven those fees up, and could right-sizing a particular regulation help bring those fees down?
I mean, again, I tend to think that those fees are market-driven, and the way that you can most effectively help the system is by extending, in terms of, especially with IPOs, simply extend the IPO on-ramp. We have 13 years of success. Right. Make it a longer period, not just limited to 5 years, but 10 years post-IPO.
Okay, thank you. I want to kind of follow up on something that my colleague, Mr. Vargas, had brought up. And you've spoken before and here today about the need to extend the IPO on-ramp from the Jobs Act. One of the benefits of on-ramp and emerging growth companies designation from jobs is that exemption from the Sarbanes-Oxley 404B, as you were discussing earlier. Can you expand on why the provision in Sarbanes-Oxley, what is the provision in Sarbanes-Oxley, and why it's so difficult to comply with for new companies?
Well, it's a provision that originally comes from banking regulation, so it's focused more on the internal control process that a company would have, and it's related to ultimately safety and soundness concerns of a particular company. So what happened with Sarbanes-Oxley is that system was imposed on the entire public company ecosystem, notwithstanding the fact that the best way to target that regulation would have been to target it at the companies that pose the most systemic risk. So again, total market capitalization is almost exclusively much larger companies. So you can readily give significant relief to newcomers, new entrants into the system, and without any offsetting increase in systemic risk to total market cap.
Okay. Something else I'd like for you to elaborate on. You've made it clear in here that an exemption from 404B, an extension for ECG is safe. Why do you feel that is safe?
I would point you to 13 years of successful experience with new IPO companies. And again, the IPO on-ramp concept was borrowed from SEC rules. So even under SEC rules, regardless of the size of a company, as a new IPO company, you get until your second annual report before you have to comply with Section 404B. That's just a recognition of the fact that it takes a lot of time to put all those processes in place. So with companies that satisfy the EGC definition, as long as they continue to do so, they have that relief. And again, Mr. Newell's point, spoken like a CEO, that relief can and should be extended based on 13 years of successful experience. This is not, it's no longer experimental. We have the data, you've done it, it succeeded fabulously, you should extend this concept.
So at that stage of a company's growth, 404A is adequate as far as the internal management assessment?
Yes, absolutely. Management is required to maintain effective internal control over financial reporting. They're required to assess the effectiveness of it and certify to it. Mr. Newell has signed his name on the dotted line as to that effectiveness. This is a very significant enforcement mechanism on its own. But then to have, in addition to the financial statement audit, which is a big undertaking, a separate internal controls audit is a significant cost.
Okay, thank you. I yield back. Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Illinois, the vice-ranking member of the committee, Mr. Casson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. So I think, and I'm sure my colleagues will correct me if I have this wrong, I think Dr. Foster and I are the only two members of this committee who actually have entrepreneurial experience in terms of taking a business from an idea through attracting talent, fundraising, making it into something that was cash flow positive, and ultimately selling on the back end. I say that not to brag, but to say that it is important that our nation's CEOs have representation in Washington. They often don't have a loud enough voice. And speaking as one myself, our nation's CEOs desperately would like more access to capital without constraints. Certainly in my own experience, it was a nuisance having young whip-smart MBAs riffling through my books and questioning my wisdom from the local private equity fund. I also did not particularly want to get involved in all the nuisance of public disclosure that the SEC would require for investor protection. If you are fortunate enough to have someone of Dr. Foster's and my temperament and wisdom, you don't need investor protection. All you need is our wisdom as entrepreneurs. Not everybody has that, of course. And I say that because, the United States economy is the envy of the world because historically we have balanced that tension between access to capital for entrepreneurs and making sure we have deep capital markets. We have the deepest capital markets in the world. We also have robust investor protections. But if we've learned anything from the first 65 days of the Trump administration, arsonists can work a lot faster than home builders do. Things that take lifetimes to build, from our relationships with our European allies to basic decency to basic national security protocols, can be destroyed overnight and take a long time to rebuild. And so we've seen, $4 trillion of collapse in equity values. We've seen a collapse in M&A activity. We've seen a large number of private equity firms who are now raising debt in order to pay dividends, which I think is banker speak for let's kick the can down the road and hope that a future administration will fix what just got broke. But it feels to me in this moment that we need to be doubling down on investor protection because that's who's going to get hurt if we're not careful. And to that end, Mr. Trotter, I'd like to chat a little bit about some of these fund-to-fund structures. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that right now if you're going to set up a registered fund of funds, you've got a registered investment advisor who has a fiduciary obligation to the fund. Got that right? So if you were to bring retail investors into that structure, would that RIA provide investor protection for the retail investors, or would that be treated as a separate class?
I would have to that's outside of my area, so I'd have to get back to you on that.
Okay, does anybody know the answer to that question? Because, the concern is you don't want to have multiple tiers in the capital structure that could run down. Let me stay with you, Mr. Trotter. Right now, it's also my understanding that SEC staff positions have generally said that fund of funds should not have more than 40% investment in any fund to maintain diversity, but that's not a formal rule. It's sort of general guidance. Do I have that right?
I'm sorry. My area is in the 33 and 34 Act, and that's my area of expertise. So I'm probably not the right person to comment on 40 Act.
Okay, well, I guess what I'm asking is, it seems to me like there's a benefit in diversity, and I think we can agree that I think there's a bipartisan agreement of increasing access to these vehicles, but do retail investors have protections in those under current structure, or do we have to add additional rules? I guess, Mr. Case, I'd turn to you. Do you think if we were to make this expansion that we should ensure that those fund of funds have some kind of mandated diversity of funds or some additional protection for retail investors who don't have the sophistication that the Fidelities of the world or the pension funds do.
A couple points. First of all, I think in terms of retail investors who might become able to invest in companies or funds, if there's a change in the rules around accredited investors, actually investing in funds for most of them might be the smarter way to go. It's a little bit why investing in the stock market, you can pick stocks, or you can invest in a fund manager who will manage it for you. You might not get the full upside than if you pick them, but you also sometimes can hedge some of the downside. So actually making it easier for people to invest in more diversified funds that are investing in multiple funds or multiple companies, I think is important.
But I guess the concern there was unless we put in the kind of disclosures that public companies have, you've got retail investors who may not have the sophistication, don't understand the liquidity issues, don't understand the way the capital structure was set up, where they're going to be underwater in most likely scenarios. How do we get that protection if we don't have the kind of disclosures that we have in an SEC environment?
I do think the process of deciding what an accredited investor should be and what kind of tests should be put in place other than just wealth, I think there's a number of proposals being considered. I'm sure the SEC can figure out an appropriate way to strike that balance. Having
the gentleman's time has expired.
I'm out of town, but welcome any continued comments. Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio, the chairman of the National Security, Illicit Finance, and International Financial Institutions Subcommittee and the sponsor of H.R. 145, Risk Disclosure and Investor Attestation Act. Mr. Davidson is recognized.
Thank the chairman. Thank our colleagues and our committee. To Mr. Kasten, he and Mr. Foster may be the only two Democrats with private sector experience, but thankfully that's not true of the Republican side of the aisle. I hope he gets to know some more of us better. The witnesses do have lots of private sector experience. I appreciate you guys being here, and frankly, for some of you, I've really admired what you've done. Mr. Case in particular, who didn't notice the rise of AOL and a lot of the work you've done since. But I noted that you have ties back to Cincinnati with Procter & Gamble. And of course, Ms. Matthews-Burkeen, based out of Cincinnati, so great to see our slice of America so well represented here today. And that's part of the goal is, America does so well with less than 5% of the world's population. We have roughly 25% of the world's GDP, but over 50% of the world's invested capital. Unfortunately, that capital isn't all invested in Cincinnati and Western Ohio and Ohio, as well as it is in some other slices of America. And I think it's great that we've got this hearing today to highlight how we can help see some of that capital flow invested differently. Frankly, one of the concerns I've had is for small and mid-market firms in particular, when they want to raise capital, they don't really have as big of an offering. They don't even intend to build an enterprise that is going to attract the kind of valuations that do well in IPOs. You have to raise pretty substantial capital to cover the regulatory barrier. And then if you want to even solicit an offering, often that offering is shaped by rules that are fundamentally, they say to protect investors, but the reality is we know it's really protecting deal flow for a lot of people that are already wealthy, and they get first looks at some of the deals. And that's why I've introduced the bill Mr. Stile referenced, which is the Risk Disclosure Attestation Act, which is, since it's my money, let me acknowledge the risks and make my own investments. And while here in Congress we might not have a path to do that, my hope is that we could do that in Ohio. So Ms. Matthews-Burkeen, if we could simply have that act pass in Ohio with the limitation that you're soliciting investment from Ohioans and not across state lines, what would that do for a fund like what you're operating in terms of the ability to raise capital and deploy it in Ohio?
It would definitely help our fund, but also entrepreneurs around the state. So the gentleman from Kentucky earlier today referenced the Bluegrass Angels. That group was formed from Kentucky tax credits, allowing investors to invest into companies from Kentucky. That was an incredible program for them, and they saw lots of other new angel groups pop up around the state. So with what you're saying, I think that Risk Disclosure Attestation Act would definitely be helpful in the state of Ohio.
Yeah, so we can hopefully do that for the whole country, but if not, I've been talking with our lawmakers that are state-based and saying, well, why can't we do some of these nice things for our own state make Ohio a better destination for capital. You know, Mr. Case, in your opinion, what kinds of opportunities are being missed by, you know, places like Ohio as so much capital is flowing to 3 states that you highlighted in your opening testimony?
I appreciate you referencing my first job was in Cincinnati. I enjoyed my time there. My second job was in Wichita, Kansas. I enjoyed my time there. I was born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, and then started AOL in Northern Virginia. So maybe that helps inform some of my empathy and passion around the rise of the rest of the entrepreneurs building companies in other places. I think it's also worth noting that venture capital is a relatively new concept. It didn't exist 60, 70 years ago. Then if you had an idea, you went to the bank and got a loan, but banks usually don't loan to risky startups unless there's a personal guarantee, which also creates some risk. So venture capital becomes a path for people to start companies if they don't have capital or easy access to capital. And some of the things that this committee is considering that will make it easier for new venture funds to start and scale in places like Ohio and other parts of the country, I think is a step in the right direction. As these companies scale, making it a little easier to consider going public as a young emerging growth company also is important. That's obviously a key part of the Jobs Act I worked on more than a decade ago. I think so. We have made progress. We continue to be the most innovative entrepreneurial nation in the world, but we can continue to build on that and try to create a more inclusive innovation economy. So it's not just the coast, it's everybody everywhere.
Thank you for that. And one area that I hope we get to is debt, because whether companies want to do an initial public offering or not, their ability to solicit debt outside of bank debt, because there are risk classifications that are different, could really help capital formation. My time has expired, and I yield.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Liccardo, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for your testimony. It's been very informative. Mr. Case, I really want to thank you for your pioneering work in our innovation economy and for your work with Rise with the for the Rest. It's important. I think we all recognize I'm from Silicon Valley, but it's important that opportunity be broadly distributed in our country, and I appreciate your great work there, as well as with President Obama's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, which ultimately resulted in the recommendations we see that formed the Jobs Act in 2012, which I think has spawned great progress, though obviously we have much more work to do. You know, in page 4 of your remarks, your written remarks, as well as a little bit in your testimony, we've heard a bit about your view of talent. That's not just about capital flows. In fact, talent can be more important than capital. Specifically in page 4, you talk about high-skill immigration. And I agree with your assessment. Talent is evenly distributed in this world and across the globe. And as we think about the imperative for ensuring access to talent in our country, I mean, you mentioned certainly the Heartland Visa, which is promising, but wouldn't it be true also that generally lifting the lid on immigration, particularly high-skill immigration, would be a great boon for the entire country? For example, if at the University of Arkansas, they could staple a green card to every diploma of a graduate in science or tech, wouldn't that do great wonders for Arkansas?
Yes, no, I've been vocal about this for 2 decades, testified in the Senate around immigration reform over a decade ago. I believe this part of the secret sauce that's powered the American economy is being a magnet for talent, people coming here from all around the world, which doesn't mean we, of course, don't want to develop our own talent and improve our education system and teach more skills around creativity, communications, collaborations are things that are critical for entrepreneurial success. We need to continue to remain that of immigrants. So I do worry. I understand it's tied up in a much more complicated and very sensitive, highly politically charged discussion around immigration. But I think we do run the risk of losing our edge, you know, now that we've seen the globalization of innovation, a globalization of entrepreneurship, a globalization of the capital markets. And so I think it is very important that the Congress continue to focus on this issue and figure out how to strike the right balance so we can continue to attract people when they graduate from our universities, try to, as you say, staple a green card, make sure that we're keeping as many people here as possible, attracting as many people to come here as possible, because the data is pretty compelling that these aren't job takers, but job makers. And having more entrepreneurs, building more companies that are creating more jobs and driving more economic growth and doing it in more parts of the country, I think is essential as we think about this next chapter for America.
Thank you, Mr. Case. I appreciate that. As you know, I come from a region of the country where more than 40% of our adults were born in a foreign country. I think that's something to do with the secret of our success. And more than half of our venture-funded startups are, in fact, have a foreign-born founder. I'd like to see that happen elsewhere in the country as well. Mr. Newell, really want to thank you for your leadership in the Bay Area as a business leader, and certainly with BIO, which is an incredibly important organization for biotech industry. I agree with your fundamental notion that we need to expand the definition of accredited investors to really get at a more sophisticated definition that focuses on the competence, the capacity of the investor, not simply their wealth. And you seem to acknowledge that Mr. Foster's recommendation was not a bad one of having actual sophistication applied to industries or sub-industries. But we're currently facing an administration that is essentially defunding the financial police at the SEC. How can we do that in a world in which we have fewer and fewer folks to actually implement?
That's the conundrum, to be honest. In order to expand access to capital, you need to expand the people who we think are rightly able to assess the risk of an opportunity. At the same time, as Mr. Trotter talked about, there are fundamental laws that are necessary to protect the integrity of the capital markets and to protect investors as well. If we have lawyers leaving the SEC, we will have less enforcement, and that allows for more fraud to occur. If we have reviewers leaving the SEC who are not replaced, then your process of actually getting your registration statement filed, processed, and approved is going to take longer. It presently takes about 90 to 150 days in order to do that. So making it longer would be harder.
Thank you, sir. You have my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Stile, and I want to thank Chairman Hill and Ranking Member Waters for holding this important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for taking time to be with us today. I know it's a sacrifice when you come to do this, and we appreciate it. Most venture capital funding is concentrated, as we've heard discussed today, in California, Massachusetts, and New York, despite these states having high individual income tax rates. Meanwhile, my home state of Tennessee proudly boasts no state-level individual income tax, yet Tennessee lags behind these other states in venture capital funding. Mr. Trotter, what factors contribute to this disparity? And I know we've heard some of that today. And why don't states like Tennessee, which would seem to foster interest from investors because of the tax treatment, why do they have a significant economic advantage over Tennessee and attract more venture capital funding?
Well, I think you're going to the heart of a lot of what Mr. Case has spent a long time trying to solve. I would defer to his insights on the answer to that question. My perspective is simply to foster IPO activity, you want to streamline that process and make it less burdensome, and you want to make it less burdensome for a company to become, once it is public, to begin life as a new public company and extend the period of relief that's available for those companies based on 13 years of successful experience.
Well, so I'll take you up on your challenge, and Mr. Case, you might speak to that. It would seem, it's at least to me, and I was, as my friend Mr. Davidson pointed out, some of us, many of us on this side of the aisle were successful in starting businesses, and I certainly was, and thankful to be in a state like Tennessee where we got favorable tax treatment. Speak to that, if you will.
Well, there's a lot going on in Tennessee. I know it pretty well. I actually have a couple grandkids growing up in Nashville. We have investments in Chattanooga and other parts of the state. And actually, our first Rise the Rest tour over 10 years ago, Nashville was part of that visit. So the momentum there and the cranes, building there are showing real momentum in that city. As you say, though, a lot of it's attracting bigger companies, in part because of tax, but also the talent pool and other kinds of things to be there. The question is, how do you get more of the entrepreneurs staying there and starting there? And that ties in with some of the things we've been talking about today. Having more regional venture funds that are based in Tennessee matters. Having people focus in the area, including things like the Startup Tennessee efforts, and having the Nashville Entrepreneurship Center helps enable more momentum there. So I think the momentum is building in Nashville and Chattanooga and other parts of the state, but it can go higher. Obviously, Tennessee is a big state with a lot of opportunities, but still relative to other places like California, New York, Massachusetts are not getting access to the capital. That does lead some of the people growing up in Tennessee to decide to leave to go to the coast. So we have to stop that, or at least slow that.
Is it about that critical mass? Is that really the factor, or are there things that Tennessee and other states are not doing that they should be doing to foster that?
Well, it's a number of things. We've talked about capital access. That's critically important. If you don't have the ability to start the company, it's obviously not going to get started. We've talked about talent. How do you make sure you have a critical mass of talent, which is why clustering in different cities makes sense. It doesn't just have to be a few cities, though. We want it to be dozens and dozens of cities. There are some cultural aspects. I think Tennessee is doing a good job of this, but how do you make sure entrepreneurs in your community recognize that you are celebrating their risk-taking, and if they fail, encourage them, get up again, try again. Some communities that people would then be branded a failure. One of the great things about Silicon Valley is that's just viewed as a process of a part of the process of becoming an entrepreneur. Sometimes you, including me, I got it wrong the first time before I got it right with AOL. And so creating that culture where people recognize the importance of entrepreneurs, recognize they are the innovators, they are the pioneers. It does take a lot of risk, and be supportive of them, I think, is critically important. But Tennessee's doing well.
So you mentioned in your, Mr. Case, in your written testimony, highlights of the importance of competing globally with China by boosting investments in research and development at our universities. And little time left here, but in my own business startup, we have eventually had to abandon the Chinese market because they stole our intellectual property. We ultimately decided there just wasn't enough upside there. In the 10 seconds left here, how do we confront that? We make these investments in developing IP, but do we really cash in on them as a country if we don't protect our innovators?
We do need to protect our IP, no question, with other countries now competing in a variety of technologies, AI, robotics, and other kinds of things. And we need to continue to invest in that R&D. My company, AOL, wouldn't have been possible without the government creating the internet through the investments in DARPA. So we need to make sure we're planting that seed corn of new innovation.
My time has expired. I yield back, Mr.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Tlaib, the gentlewoman from Michigan, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Many people think that the primary purpose of the stock market is to raise funds for companies, but that's not actually the case. When companies want capital for investment, they rely on retained earnings, bank loans, and corporate bond market, and then maybe the stock market. Take the difference between primary and secondary markets. Ms. Shaw, I don't know if you know, can you explain the difference between primary and secondary stock markets?
Yeah, if you're speaking about our, very publicly traded markets, NASDAQ versus over-the-counter type markets. Yep. Some of them, over-the-counter markets have penny stocks and higher risk type investments versus our public markets who have to adhere to massive disclosures and other requirements. So our smaller secondary markets, also face the investors, have different, their risk tolerances are different on the secondary markets, I guess I would ask.
Well, in 2022, I think this is why it's important, the value of stocks traded in the U.S. was about $44 trillion. And then the value of new securities issued by U.S. corporations that year, that is the primary market activity, was just at $71 billion. And so mostly the stock market is where early investors cash out and the wealthy speculate.
Okay.
Yeah, and I say that because the bottom 50% of households in our country ranked by wealth, only 1% of corporate equities and mutual fund share, it's only 1%. The wealthiest 10% of those households, on the other hand, own 87% of all corporate equities in mutual fund shares. So I think it's just really important to see when we talk about this where the real impact is. But there are institutions whose sole mission is to provide access to capital for the households and companies that they need most. And so one of the things that I've, like for instance, I don't know if you're familiar with the community development
CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions, provide financial services and access to capital to low-income individuals and communities, especially around affordable housing. If that's their purpose. That's the purpose of CDFIs. However, earlier this month, the president issued an executive order eliminating much of the CDFI fund as the law allows. It's being challenged. So can you explain what the CDFI funds does and what the impact in eliminating might be right now?
While the state securities regulators don't directly administer those funds, I did reach out to my colleagues in the banking and credit union world, and they all were emphatic about the impact that CDFIs have had on their communities, especially, I'll speak for Alabama and the rural communities. I know there was upwards of $18 million in financial impact in our communities, so they provided me success stories about the program.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's both rural and urban, but most of it's even around addressing the housing crisis that we have in our country right now. You know, many of the communities, the one in your community, in your backyard, and one in my backyard in Detroit, I mean, these communities are starved for investment. And that's why CDFIs have played an incredibly important role in providing that capital. And the fund is effective. I mean, I think on an average, recipients leverage each dollar awarded by the fund into $8 of funding from the sources. Over the last 10 years, this is important for my colleagues, at last 10 years, CDFI fund has helped finance over 500,000 units of affordable housing, 42,000 commercial real estate projects, and 17.9 million in personal loans, and 1.3 million in small business loans. So I don't know how we can talk about access to capital in this committee when the president is trying to take away from the very people it helps the most. CDFIs are critical. One last question for you, Ms. Shawn. You know, last week, the new director of the Federal Housing Financial Agency, FHFA, Bill, is it Pulte maybe? Is that Bill Pulte? Are you familiar with that new director? Well, he appointed himself the chair of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Now the FHFA is the regulator of both agencies. Do you understand? Is this a conflict?
Those decisions that were made at the executive level, you know, are
But we have a regulator that sits now on the board, the very agency he's supposed to regulate.
those are decisions that are made at the executive level.
But isn't that a conflict?
The states, you know, aren't.
I mean, common sense tells you it's a conflict of interest.
Those are
Don't make no
decisions.
sense. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. I want to start with you, Mr. Newell, if I can. Your opening testimony, you told the story of Sutro and the evolution from startup to public company, and navigating that's a challenge and something that we want more companies in the United States to do, and making sure that those startups have access to the public markets is essential. It was just referenced that maybe they could use retained earnings. Can startups use retained earnings? Maybe we just knock that question out of the gates. Do you have retained earnings in your startup?
We have no retained earnings. We have
of course
lots
not,
of
because
losses.
it's a startup, right?
That's exactly
So you're
right.
looking for figuring out where you have finance, and the capital markets are really, really important, in particular in our startups. And you took advantage of the emerging growth company status in that startup. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
And would you have been able to go public in the manner and the time frame that you did without the EGC status that was available to you? And if not, why not?
It would have been much more challenging for us to do that, because the amount of financial resources that we would have needed to front-end load to meet the requirements of full disclosure under 404B would have been prohibitive. We would have had to quadruple our accounting function and hope that we still got public.
So you would have had to triple it. So then the reverse question would be, what happens when you lose EGC status? Would you have to triple that then?
We lost EGC status because we went over the public float threshold for a brief period of time, and it cost us $1 million in extra fees for accounting purposes.
So would your view then, so would your view be that we should then re-examine the current time limit on EGC status?
Yes, sir, and thank you for your leadership on that.
I appreciate that. And then I'm going to jump to you, Mr. Trotter, if I can. Some have claimed that extending EGC status would put investors at risk. We heard actually comments from one of my colleagues here. But nothing in the jobs or the EGC bill would alter the application for existing anti-fraud provisions, correct?
Exactly right.
It would have no impact on SEC disclosures and reporting obligations, is that correct?
Correct.
And it would have no impact on corporate governance standards, is that correct?
Yes.
And it would have no reporting obligations of officer. It would have no impact on the reporting obligations of officers, directors, and significant stockholders, correct?
That's right.
And so are investors at risk if we allow an extension of the EGC status?
Not at all.
And so why should we have the EGC status then in the first place?
Again, it's about allowing the system to scale the regulatory burden to the size of the company being regulated. And the EGC definition shows you that there's an opportunity to extend that.
I appreciate that. I just think it's so important that we look at allowing startups to have an avenue and access into the public markets, that we're encouraging U.S. domiciled, U.S. employers to have access to those public markets so that they can grow and grow here in the United States so that people can get good and better paying jobs than they already have. In my limited time left, I want to stay with you, if I can, Mr. Trotter, and dig into the WICSI issue. Companies that qualify as well-known seasoned issuers, WICSI, are granted more flexibility in accessing U.S. public markets through automatic shelf registrations. I have a bill that would expand the WICSI status by updating the definition to apply to all companies that otherwise satisfy the WICSI definition with a public flow to 75 million instead of 750 million. Again, driving that access further down into the market. Can you discuss briefly why expanding the WICSI eligibility would promote capital formation while maintaining investor protections?
Yes, and I'm strongly supportive of this measure that you've introduced. This is a category of issuer that's been around now for more than 20 years. The SEC introduced it in 2005. It's been incredibly successful. It's been very helpful for companies going to market to take advantage of opportunistic timing and to be able to control more of their capital formation destiny as they go to market. The eligibility for short form registration was based in 1992. The SEC looked at what companies have an efficient market in their security. That was before the modern internet, and that was before EDGAR. The SEC filings even became available online. Obviously, technology has drastically accelerated the efficiencies there, and your bill merges those two categories. It's a great step forward.
Thank you very much. I thank you all for being here today. I think it's so important that we're making sure that we have capital access available to startup companies across the United States of America in big cities like New York, that's fine, but also in states like mine, in Wisconsin, and in the state of our next gentleman, we're jumping over. I was going to say Indiana, but I'll yield back. We'll come to you in a moment, my colleague from Indiana. We now recognize the gentleman from Texas, the ranking member for Oversight and Investment Subcommittee, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and of course we want access to capital in Texas as well. So, I thank the witnesses for appearing and would associate myself with the ranking member's opening statement and would agree that what I'm about to talk about is beyond Silicon Valley. It is about expanding access to capital, but it takes a slightly different twist because I received this communique and it indicates within that you are holding a real check for $1,250. Sure enough, there is a check for $1,250. And it goes on to indicate that if I accept this promissory note, then I should keep it for my records. And I can understand why, because on the reverse side of this page, there's information about what the consequences are of accepting this promissory note. And one of the items indicated that I will be agreeing to is this. This has an annual percentage rate. I assume all of the witnesses are familiar with the term annual percentage rate. If you're not, would you raise your hand? Okay, let the record reflect that they're all familiar with it. It says the annual percentage rate would be 91.27%. 91.27%. I see you all looking in dismay, and I was too. In fact, I was thunderstruck when I received this. 91.27%, $1,250 loan, finance charge $700, total repayment $1,950. Says I'll be paying $100 for an acquisition charge, $600 for installment account handling charge. Well, and by the way, can be accelerated without notice. I think that this is egregious, and I think that while we are concerned about the businesses, and I have many small businesses in my district, I'm also concerned about the consumers. And this type of loan, in my opinion, epitomizes what predatory lending is all about. To receive this check, a live check that I can cash, and then receive this loan. Oh, I might add this. It was sent to me in English and in Spanish, the offer, but the actual information concerning the contract, all of that is in English. Bait you in the language that you speak, and then have you sign a contract in a language that you may not be as familiar with. This causes me a good deal of concern because we have a CFPB that is now wounded. And I'm curious as to what consumers who receive this type of predatory offer will do once they conclude that they have been in some way harmed. Who do they turn to without a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau? Which leads me to what I plan to do. I'm going to ask the chair of the committee to hold a hearing on predatory lending. It would seem to me that this is very important to the consumer. I appreciate what we're doing for the businesses, but the consumer is also of paramount importance. And I will be making this request. Again, $1,250 loan, annual percentage rate, 91.27%. Just for edification purposes, would any of you accept a loan that had an annual percentage rate in excess of 90%? If you would, raise your hand. Okay, let the record reflect that no hands have been raised, and I will understand why. I won't put you on the spot and ask you why you wouldn't. I would simply say, for me, it's quite egregious, and I do plan to ask the chairman to convene a hearing on this type of predatory lending. This is something that concerns my constituents. This is a kitchen table issue. Some of these other issues that we confront, they may be kitchen table issues, but they're not for the people that I represent for the most part. Perhaps for the plutocrats, these are kitchen table issues, some of these other things. But this is bread and butter for a lot of people in my district. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for my questions. First, I want to begin by thanking the witnesses for being with us today. And before I get on to my thoughts, my mortgage I'm about to sign is 6.5%, and that's the annual percentage rate. If I were to get a payday loan because I needed money for a week at 2%, that would be 104% APR. So it all depends on the length of time and the need of the money. And I think that we got to stop using APR because it is not a good reflection of the value of access to capital for shorter duration periods of time. On to the topic at hand. Expanding access to capital for American entrepreneurs, specifically venture capital funds, is an important issue not only for the startup ecosystem, but for the economic environment in general. While venture capital plays a vital role in fueling innovation and economic growth, the reality is that most VC funding is concentrated in just a few states, leaving many promising entrepreneurs across the country struggling to secure the capital they need to scale. This imbalance has real consequences. Entrepreneurs outside of major tech hubs face significant challenges, particularly when it comes to raising early-stage funding, which is essential for growth. Without access to Series A and B funding, many startups never get the chance to reach their full potential. By reducing regulatory hurdles and expanding opportunities for capital formation, we can help create a more comprehensive and dynamic startup landscape, one that supports innovation and job creation in every corner of the country, not just in a handful of cities. Mr. Case, Section 3C1 of the Investment Company Act of 1940 exempts funds with fewer than 100 beneficial owners from registration as an investment company. It also includes an exemption for qualified venture funds with fewer than 250 beneficial owners and $10 million in aggregate capital contributions and uncalled capital commitments. Can you explain, based on your experience, the difficulty in complying with these thresholds?
Thank you for your question and your preamble talking about the importance of obviously entrepreneurship and making sure capital is available to entrepreneurs everywhere. In terms of some of the specific rules on venture funds, I think limitations such as you talked about would result in, as venture firms start scaling, they would not be able to accept new investors. And I think opening up to a broader range of investors, including relooking at the accredited investor rules, would be a step in the right direction to help those venture funds that can then help invest in companies, hopefully in their regions.
Thank you for that. Ms. Matthews-Burkeen, would raising the cap for the qualifying venture capital fund exemption to $150 million, increasing the number of allowable beneficial owners to 2,000, help VC firms, especially smaller firms in underserved regions, to better support entrepreneurs and drive investment?
Yes, it absolutely would. It would open up a brand new market for us. For a smaller firm, as I said earlier, kind of like a $50 million minimally viable firm, that would open up a lot of kind of smaller dollar checks and allow us to grow new funds across states in the middle of America.
Thank you for that. I'm proud that my bill, the Improving Capital Allocation for Newcomers, or ICANN Act, was included in the chairman's Expanding Access to Capital package last Congress and was once again considered in the Capital Markets Subcommittee this session. The ICANN Act makes it easier for South Carolina investors to support local startups and entrepreneurs by raising the cap on qualifying venture capital funds from $10 million to $150 million and increasing the investor limit from 250 to 600. We're removing barriers that have held small businesses back for too long. These changes will give overlooked entrepreneurs the capital they need to grow, create jobs, and strengthen our economy. Ms. Matthews-Burkeen, based on your experience, how frequently do small businesses and entrepreneurs face exclusion from the investment landscape due to excessive regulatory hurdles or high barriers to entry?
Every day. It's an everyday thing, especially in my state, the state of Ohio. We have, oh my goodness, less than 20 large venture capital funds in our state. And if you're thinking about going to each of those individual funds, some of them are only making 5 to 10 investments a year, and there are thousands of startups that need support and capital.
Thank you for that. The last 4 years, we've gotten very out of balance with our regulatory schemes, and we're not keeping up with the legal frameworks for businesses to thrive. This country needs to be the best place to start a business, to grow a business, and we're working here in Congress with the administration to get us back in line so we can continue to be competitive in the global economy. That's what's driving a lot of the legislation. That's what's driving all of the current administration's decision-making, and I think things are going very well, and I'm very optimistic for the future. With that, I yield back. I now recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Stutzman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all for being here. This is a topic that I always enjoy discussing, and as an entrepreneur myself and have the experience of raising capital over the last 8 years in the private sector, it's a thrill, and sometimes it's not. But it's an interesting time, especially with all of the macroeconomics, not only here in the United States, but around the world as well. And there's the old saying that capital is cowardly, and there's times that we hope. I mean, every project is a worthwhile project, but we also know that not every project works out. In fact, the majority of them don't work out. And so it does. We do have to be careful in that it's not just loose, and that there's people that are taken advantage of. But at the same time, this is also what makes America the greatest nation on earth. And I've got a bill that I'd like to ask Ms. Matthews-Burkeen a question about. My bill is the Investment Opportunity Expansion Act, which would allow an individual to qualify as an accredited investor if their aggregate investment is an unregistered securities offering, if it's not more than 10% of the individual's net assets or the individual's annual income, whichever is greater. How would expanding the accredited investor definition while limiting an investor's risk exposure benefit Main Street investors and ultimately strengthening our capital markets?
It would give people an incredible opportunity. So I mentioned earlier, there are lots of other things that we can spend our money on. We can spend our money on cryptocurrency, sports betting, you name it, but not necessarily things that we can really generate wealth from. That would be a wealth-generating opportunity for people across the country. I think putting guardrails, to the earlier Congressman's point, is necessary to protect people because we are in a moment where consumers need to be protected.
Yeah. Would anybody else on the panel like to comment on accredited investors, the increase?
You know, I think the way the accredited investor definition works today, it really does not allow for individuals who can understand and financially afford the risk to take it. If you happen to be born rich, then you're presumed to be a brilliant investor, but really you were born rich.
Yeah, no. Well, and one of the things that I often see is that a lot of folks in the Midwest in Indiana, where I'm from, they want to invest in Indiana. And they would, you know, and it's also nice to be able to see wherever you place your money that you can drive down the street and go visit and ask questions. And I think that's an important component to it as well. Ms. Matthews-Burkeen, I've got another question as well related to crowdfunding. We had a really good subcommittee hearing on capital markets last month in which we heard several witnesses on how we can expand access to capital for businesses. But many diverse founders and small businesses outside the traditional capital hubs have found funding opportunities through regulation crowdfunding. Why is this an important tool? Is it an important tool moving forward? And is there any particular comments you have to raising capital as in the crowdfunding mechanism?
No, crowdfunding definitely fills a gap for folks that have difficulty around raising friends and family rounds. So it gives that new opportunity. I will say that it does not necessarily signal to professional investors, however, that that investment is a good investment. So there are a lot of learnings that have to be had around crowdfunding as well. It's one thing to go out to the crowd, but likes don't necessarily generate revenue for a company. It's all about whether or not that company is sustainable over time beyond that moment of the big push of the crowdfunding campaign.
Are you seeing crowdfunding still as, I mean, there was kind of a spike there in popularity with it. Is it settling or is it still a popular option? Where do you think it's going right now?
I would say a year ago, it was much more popular. I'd say we're living in a moment right now of volatility where people aren't spending their extra cash on crowdfunding campaigns.
Yeah, I think the economy is really tight right now. People just don't have disposable income because either they could spend it in investments or they could spend it on going out to eat. And I think we're seeing that it's not happening in either one. Mr. Trotter, I'd like to ask you, I've got a bill that's called the Regulation A+ Improvement Act, which would increase the amount that companies can raise under Regulation A from $50 million to $150 million. Any thoughts or comments, good, bad, indifferent?
Step in the right direction. I think it's a helpful move.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you again to all of you. And this is, interesting times. Of course, we have a lot of decisions to make here in Washington that will affect our economy, but those decisions do affect startups, those affect growth, and hopefully we make the right decisions that people will feel confident that they can invest again and with certainty that it's a good investment. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. For today's hearing, the subject matter expanding access to capital, we don't need to search far and wide for a new solution, and we don't need to start reducing transparency requirements, loading up on investor risks by deregulating. Instead, we should focus on improving the institutions and regulations that help protect investors and to support businesses. For example, venture capital funds play a significant role in directing capital to startups. Mr. Case, you are a billionaire businessman who operates a venture capital firm, so I'm sure you would agree that VC funds can provide an array of necessary supports for businesses, from monetary investments to technical assistance, et cetera.
Yes, venture capital firms can back entrepreneurs and help start and scale the companies and create jobs and drive economic growth.
But there is room for improvement. The venture capital ecosystem is not perfect. Now, I don't want you to take this personally, Mr. Case, but far too many VC firms look just like you. And they mostly invest in startups by white men. According to Forbes, 98% of venture capital goes to white men, despite the fact that diverse-run businesses have a 25% higher return rate. Mr. Chair, I would like to enter into the record this September 2024 article titled, "Building Venture Capital That's More Inclusive Than the Boys Club."
Without objection, so ordered.
I believe it's time to start supporting venture capital funds that are investing in diverse businesses. For example, in my district, the Massachusetts 7th, Mendoza Ventures is a firm that is raking in profit in AI, cybersecurity, and fintech, with 90% of its portfolio consisting of startups led by immigrants, people of color, and women. Now, this is one VC doing this, but we need 100 more. The status quo works great for white men, but we need to expand capital access to all entrepreneurs, regardless of their race and gender. And the responsibility of recognizing and confronting the disparities in capital access shouldn't fall only on the shoulders of venture capital funds. There are other organizations that are designed to help underserved populations that this committee should be uplifting. Ms. Sen, can you talk about why Community Development Financial Institutions, CDFIs, were created and what exactly they do?
Right here. Thank you. So while the state securities regulators don't directly administer those programs, I have consulted with my colleagues in the depository institution world, and they have expressed and been emphatic about the impact that CDFIs have had on communities. I know in Alabama, we're 40% rural. They cited to several examples of where they've been able to help those underserved areas.
Thank you. So essentially, CDFIs invest capital to businesses that would otherwise be neglected and under-resourced. In the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we have more than 30 CDFIs, but I want to highlight one that's headquartered in Boston, investing in the businesses in my district. One United Bank is the largest Black-owned bank in the country and helps create economic opportunity for entrepreneurs in chronically economic distressed neighborhoods. At the height of the pandemic, many of the large and popular banks were denying PPP loans to small businesses. But One United and other CDFIs made sure that local entrepreneurs and their workers were able to make ends meet. So I'm firmly and proudly pro-CDFI. Fortunately, Donald Trump is not. Trump signed an executive order attacking the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, despite the fact that it is fully authorized by Congress. He is doing the exact opposite of what this hearing is about. Instead of expanding access to capital, Trump's executive order will make it harder to access for all businesses, urban, rural, from mom and pop shops to tech startups, whether they're in Massachusetts or Alabama. This committee cannot have a serious hearing about solutions to help businesses succeed while Trump destroys the agencies that they rely on, chokes off their capital funding, and then puts tariffs in the way. I was hearing about these fears and anxieties from small business owners throughout my district at town halls this past week. It's time for my Republican colleagues to grow a spine and obstruct these efforts and recognize that the real problem here is Donald Trump. I yield back.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Chairman of Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee, Mr. Muser, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all very much for being here and providing us this information. Appreciate it. So, according to Forbes, the number of publicly traded companies in the U.S. has dropped considerably since 1997. During the Trump years, there was a 50% increase. Under the Biden years, there was a decrease, although a slight decrease. Meanwhile, the average the cost of going public now exceeds $12 million, pricing out, obviously, small businesses and everyday investors. President Trump, Secretary Bissett, and incoming SEC Chair Paul Atkins are working to reprivatize the economy and put capital back in the hands of the American people by leveraging both public and private markets, making it simpler to raise capital so everyday investors can have access to the markets. Mr. Trotter, Americans rely on closed-end funds for retirement investing, yet SEC staff, a number of years back, limited these funds to investing just 15% of assets in private securities unless they're sold only to accredited investors. Do you believe lifting this arbitrary cap safely can expand access for everyday investors to high-growth private companies?
Yes, I do.
Okay. What do you think it should be lifted to?
Well, I don't have, I think expanding access is a good step.
I agree. Is this typical for the SEC staff to provide guidance? Again, it was back in the 90s, but is that something that's typical, or do you think should be atypical?
Well, there are a number of areas where the SEC staff provides its interpretive guidance, and that becomes an important benchmark for private industry in figuring out how to apply either the statute or a rule that the SEC has adopted.
Okay. Hopefully, the new administrator keeps an eye on that. I think he will. Crowdfunding, issuers raising $100,000 or less to provide independently reviewed financial statements. Current law does not require crowdfunding under $100,000. I plan on introducing the Access Act of 2025, which increases that amount to $500,000. I see you're nodding your head. You think that's a good idea? Ms. Brackeen, your thoughts?
No, absolutely. That's one of the kind of biggest barriers to entry on the crowdfunding campaigns, is that those independent audits, small firms don't have the capital to do those each and every year to fundraise.
So primarily, you think that would be beneficial to small business?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Mr. Case, nice to see you again. Venture capital goes to businesses in large metro areas, far more than rural areas, California, New York, Massachusetts, et cetera. If we made it easier for venture capital funds to operate, for example, by raising the $10 million limit on what qualifies as a small fund, do you think that would help more money reach startups in rural areas?
Yes, it would.
Okay. Good. Well, that sounds easy enough, right? We'll get on that one as well. Mr. Trotter, back to you. The average cost of going public, $12 million. You think expanding the current on-ramp relief for emerging companies, like requiring 2 years of financial statements instead of 3, would make it easier for more companies to go public?
Yes, I do. I'm strongly supportive of that.
Okay. So we think just making things easier, simpler, less regulations will be beneficial to businesses, to our economy, to overall growth of small businesses and large businesses.
Yes,
that
all
makes
of
a
the
lot
above.
of, that's very logical, makes a lot of sense. The CFPB is going to go under reform. Many of us don't believe that CFPB has been constructive. We think it's been the opposite of constructive, perhaps destructive. Mr. Trotter, I'll go back to you. What are your thoughts on reforms to the CFPB?
I'll have to leave that to others. That's not my area.
Okay, not your area. Mr. Newell?
Sorry, Congressman, it's not my area.
Okay. Ms. Brackeen? No? Mr. Case, you must, no comment on CFPB. All right, well, we got plenty of comments on it, so we can handle minimal comments there. Access to capital during the Biden administration. These reforms will create a great deal of improvement. Ms. Brackeen, would you agree with that?
I'd prefer not to comment on that.
Okay, understood. But what we just discussed, of course, would be reforms, improvements to what's existed before, so that would create access to capital. So that's really where I was going with that. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Ms. Kim, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for testifying and appearing before our committee today. You know, you've heard the small businesses are the backbone of our economy, and it's especially important for the constituents and the businesses that I represent in Orange County, Southern California. That's why last Congress I introduced the Improving Access to Small Business Information Act with my colleague, Congressman Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey. And that bill would ensure that the process for collecting public feedback from small businesses is streamlined and more efficient at SEC. So let me ask you a question, Mr. Newell. During your tenure at Sutro, what struggles did you identify that small companies had in getting the SEC to take their feedback into account?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for your question. I think there are a number of ways in which we as a small company interacted with the SEC. From the initial stages of doing Reg D offerings through a public offering in and of itself. In a public offering process, you do your level best to try to write your registration statement so that it passes muster quickly and that you can raise the capital as quickly as possible. I will say that the regulatory response timeframes are excessively long, and the public capital markets do not wait for anyone. If money's available, you take it. And if you take too long going through a registration process, money that might have been available may no longer be there. So we're just a small cog as a small company in the wheel, and we're all treated the same, whether it's a public offering of General Motors or a public offering of Sutro Bio. The same rules and regulations apply, and I don't think people understand there are differences, and those differences need to be taken into consideration.
Thanks for that. I think the goal is if we want our businesses, especially small businesses, to grow and become more public, then we need to ensure that the SEC has no difficulty in hearing back or feedback from the businesses. So let me move on. It is my fear that when venture capital firms engage in pattern matching, I think we discussed that probably before, but they overlook talented entrepreneurs who don't fit the typical mold but have innovative ideas. Ms. Brecken, how often are you seeing these non-traditional founders overlooked by venture capital firms because the founders don't do the pattern match for stereotypical factors for success?
Yeah, people have a tendency to invest in people that they know, like, and trust, and sometimes that's in the region that they live in. But according to the Angel Capital Association, women and their angel portfolios tend to invest at a 70% rate in other women, right? And so if we apply that to other markets, if we are able to diversify the investors that are investing around the country, I think we'll see less pattern matching.
So how can we adjust our capital market regulation to incentivize more venture capital investment in very diverse founders?
Well, I think it's still important to make certain that we are funding and having programs like SSBCI. I know that has helped our state incredibly in Ohio. And those regulations and those have really helped to grow in certain areas of the state that would have never had any venture capital at all.
So your firm, Lightship Capital, how have you capitalized or utilized the enrichment programming to mentor those founders?
Well, we offer programming in 16 cities around the country, and we help companies to grow the amount of revenue that they're attracting, and we've helped, oh my gosh, $500 million in capital has been attracted to our portfolio of companies.
Thank you. You know, since COVID-19, we have seen a decline of number of companies going public because economic conditions have been unstable throughout the Biden-Harris administration. I want to ask the question to Mr. Case. Do you believe that the long-term stable economic growth that we're seeing under President Trump, who is aiming to deliver, will result in increased initial public offerings?
Well, I continue to stay out of politics and focus on policy. That's my approach for 40 years. It will continue. But I do think figuring out ways to open up the IPO market to more companies so when they have a need for capital, if it's not available in the private market, they have a path to go public makes sense. And some of the things that this committee is considering, I think, are steps in the right direction.
Thank you. Thank you, all the witnesses, for answering.
The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Witnesses, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. As we're having this discussion on capital flow in the United States and really trying to find ways to open up that flow for people, who traditionally are not your accredited investor, I think it's important to take a step back and realize something. When we made this rule decades ago, it was the understanding that this was to help protect your small net worth retail investor. But if you look at just technology over the last generation and a half, 2 generations, every American is walking around with a supercomputer in their pocket. Your average American has more information about companies and more information about markets than they ever could have possibly had at any other point in American history. Yet we still have, in my view, a very archaic rule around what we would designate to be an accredited investor to protect the American people from the hardships of capital markets. And listen, capital markets are not a guarantee. They are never a guarantee, but they do provide real opportunities for people to build wealth in this country, especially as asset ownership continues to be the driver of how people build wealth. Mr. Newell, how detrimental has the current definition of accredited investor been to capital formation?
There's no question that if you limit the number of people who can provide capital to a business, you are making it much more difficult for that business to grow and thrive and survive. So I'm in favor of a much broader statement of accredited investor that really empowers individuals, as you've suggested, to be making their own investment decisions. And that's not what the current standard allows.
What would be the economic benefit of eliminating the accredited investor rule altogether?
Again, it gives, it democratizes, if you will, the opportunity to invest in earlier stage companies and technologies, ones where you may have some acute insights as to why that technology is going to be beneficial not only to the company, but to growing in the community in terms of jobs and also growing your own personal wealth. And if you're not satisfying the current accredited investor decision, you're locked out of that investment opportunity.
Mr. Trotter, what are the regulatory restrictions that have caused the recent shift away from public offerings and towards private markets?
Well, there are many, and many of them are long-term issues. But again, I would say that the success of the Jobs Act and 13 years of experience with the IPO on-ramp can and should be extended, and you can significantly expand the category of emerging growth companies and help IPO activity.
What are the factors contributing to the rise of costs associated with going public?
Well, the regulatory burden the disproportionate regulatory burden on smaller companies trying to go public is definitely a factor. The Jobs Act was an attempt to address that. I think it has done it has made a meaningful difference, but it could make a bigger difference.
Mr. Case, what are some of the unique challenges entrepreneurs outside of the coastal venture capital hubs what are they really facing when it comes to capital formation? And Ms. Burkeen, if we have time, I would love for you to answer the same question.
As we've been talking about today, there are big challenges. If you have an idea and you don't have capital yourself, you don't necessarily have friends and family that have capital to back you, many people will never start that company. That company could have been the next big idea that could have changed the world and created a lot of jobs and driven a lot of economic growth. So access to capital, exactly what this committee is focused on, is critically important, and making it easier for entrepreneurs who have ideas to take those into the market is important. Make it easier for them to raise capital, make it easier for the venture funds, particularly regional venture funds, to raise capital. All will contribute to trying to level the playing field and create more opportunity for more people in more places.
Ms. Burkeen?
Yeah, I would say we are seeing more cities grow. So in your great state of Florida, Miami is seeing a lot of growth right now in the venture capital space, and that's because the dollars came there kind of right around COVID, and sometimes, and really a little bit before that. So you have dollars there, you've had the universities double down on computer science so that the talent is there, and we have a very diverse community of people from Latin and South America who have come and helped to grow all of those companies.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. I've been talking a lot the last couple of weeks about Florida, in a lot of respects becoming the financial capital of not just the United States, but of the world, with a lot of whether it's venture, digital assets, et cetera. But the one thing I'd be remiss in not pointing out is that it's going to be critical for the future of our economy and our nation that people who are at the bottom end of the economic ladder have real opportunities to invest in some of these fledgling companies. Imagine if a local waiter was able to invest in Snapchat.
Gentleman's
before
time
Snapchat
has
became
expired.
Snapchat. I yield.
Thank you, gentleman from Florida. The gentleman from New York is recognized. Mr. Garbarino is the author of a bill to exclude qualified institutional buyers and qualified accredited investors from the record holder account for mandatory registration, a modestly named bill, and the Small Entrepreneurs Empowerment and Development, the SEED Act. Mr. Garbarino, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that wonderful shout out about these two wonderful bills that I'm lucky to sponsor. Thank you all to the witnesses for being here today. For more than 80 years, closed-end funds have provided nearly 4 million investors, including many retirees with steady, diversified income. As registered funds, closed-end funds are subject to rigorous safeguards such as protections related to valuation, disclosure, and conflicts of interest. Thanks to Chair Wagner's leadership, the Bipartisan Increasing Investor Opportunities Act would allow retail investors to easily access a more diversified pool of private investments through strong protections of a registered fund. Mr. Trotta, do you believe that closed-end funds could be a viable option for retail investors looking to increase access to private investments?
Yes, I believe they could.
Why?
I would support more open access to retail investors generally on different products.
Wonderful. All right, great. Thank you. As fewer companies go public, there have become fewer investment opportunities for most Americans. In recent memory, alternative investments have shown value by facilitating capital formation and helping provide more uniform investment returns for individual investors. I asked this exact same question at a cap market subcommittee hearing last month, and I'm going to ask it again because I think it's important to get it on record. Mr. Case, can you speak to what role alternative investments can play in capital formation?
Well, first of all, on a personal note, I agree with the nature of your question. When I took my company, America Online, public in 1992, we raised $10 million, and the value of the company that day was $70 million. And that's why most companies were able to access the growth capital they needed. Because of the growth of the capital markets and more late-stage capital being available, as well as some of the challenges of going public and being public, that doesn't happen anymore. And so as a result, the people who saw that my company go from 70 million in value at its peak, 160 billion, those were retail investors who got the benefit of it. They've been deprived of that for most of the innovation companies that exist today. So figuring out ways to get companies on that path to being a public company. If they choose to, some prefer staying private because they can take a longer term strategy, and some have access to that late stage growth capital. But the ones who want to go public, we need to make it just a little bit easier for them to do it, a little less burdensome, a little less costly.
So that was my next question. You would agree that regulatory modernization is necessary to provide greater options to qualified and accredited investors and just the public?
Absolutely.
Wonderful, thank you. Speaking of a company's decision of whether to go public or stay private, it's often one of the most significant inflection points in a company's growth. In the case when companies deem that costs associated with going public are too high and that regulatory burdens of staying public aren't worth it, we should ensure that there's a private market framework that supports companies throughout their life cycle. I have a bill, as the chairman mentioned, that would exclude qualified institutional buyers and institutional accredited investors from the mandatory registration threshold of 2,000 or more holders of records. Mr. Trotta, should these institutional investors be counted towards this threshold? And if not, can you explain to us the benefits that their exclusion could have in a company's ability to remain private?
I support your bill. I believe they should not be. I think it's an important step in allowing a private company to keep to maintain flexibility on whether and when it becomes a public company. And your bill would be an important step toward that.
I think so as well, so I hope we have a markup soon. I hope it passes unanimously. My last question, because I have some time left. Small businesses and entrepreneurs experienced significant losses during the first half of the 2020s, which were beyond their control. Microlending has demonstrated a track record around the world for providing much-needed capital to entrepreneurs, often women, minorities, in underbanked communities. This in turn helps them start and grow their businesses. The proposed SEED Act includes micro-offering exemption that allows companies to raise up to $250,000 without any disclosure requirements, but subject to anti-fraud and bad actor disqualifications. Ms. Burkeen, can you explain how small businesses would benefit from this exemption?
So today, many people across the country don't have access to friends and family rounds. If you don't come from a wealthy family, you don't have someone to help you to get started. While I don't come from a wealthy family, my father helped me to start my first business with a $10,000 loan. And so being able to access up to $250,000 would allow us to grow companies across the country.
Wonderful. I appreciate that, and I think you're absolutely right, and we should pass the SEED Act as quickly as possible. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for hanging in there. I know it's been kind of a long morning. Mr. Newell, you've seen firsthand how the regulatory burdens, and I know you spoke about this earlier, do the compliance costs and disclosure requirements push companies to seek alternative paths like mergers, private funding, or even overseas markets?
You know, the compliance costs of going public are substantial. I think we've talked about it today. I know we spent about $5 million in accounting just to satisfy the accounting requirements to go public. So when you know that that money is going to go out of pocket with no real benefit to you and your business, you naturally think about alternative strategies to finance the company and move it forward. And the ones that you've suggested are things that happen. There's a process called a dual track process that exists where oftentimes companies will look to either raise capital through an initial public offering or at the same time look to sell or merge their company into another company. And that's because they don't necessarily want the burdensome consequences of going public and may be able to actually continue their journey as a company, but in a different fashion.
So do you think if Congress extended kind of the on-ramp period, you know, what changes would be necessary to ensure kind of that the companies themselves not only go public, but also kind of thrive in the public markets
I think
long term?
Yeah.
You know?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I think it's important that we have ways in which not only companies avoid excess of costs that really do not contribute to the growth of the company and are not necessary for investor protections, but then look at ways in which we can expand the access to capital to those companies. Oftentimes, just because you go public, it doesn't mean you've got all the capital in the world that you need. And so you continually have to look for new sources of capital. That's certainly very true in our biotechnology industry. You need to keep going back and finding new investors, and that means any limitation on who can invest, the amounts they can invest, all of that is a barrier to your being able to continue and succeed with your business.
Very good, thank you. Mr. Case, expanding and diversifying the pool of individuals who qualify as accredited investors, as we know, is essential to unlocking new funding opportunities especially for entrepreneurs, right? And founders in really companies, small companies across the whole nation. So some of those current regulations, as has been discussed this morning and this afternoon, still pose significant challenges. I mean, that's why we're here today, I think. How do current regulations around accredited investors create barriers for both the investors and the entrepreneurs? And I know you've discussed this again earlier, but what are some of the reforms that would help expand access to capital while maintaining the protections that investors are looking for?
Obviously, we have to strike the right balance, giving people the opportunity to invest, but in a way that is safe and makes sense. But it goes back to what I said before, and probably should have emphasized it more earlier. There's sort of been a structural change in the capital markets in the last several decades. And in my era, when companies like my company, AOL, was going public, but also when Microsoft was going public and Amazon was going public and many other companies were going public in the 1990s, they generally raised capital much earlier in the cycle. All of those, for example, the valuations at the time were in the few $100 million range. Now nobody goes public until there are many billions of dollars of valuation. What that essentially means is those retail investors who believed in Microsoft or believed in Amazon and were able to get in kind of on the ground floor, not at the first venture capital level, but kind of on the ground floor, were able to see the benefit of that, and it benefited their families in terms of the appreciation of wealth. That's largely been taken away because companies are not going public until it's much later, and that's not entirely because of regulation. Some companies choose not to go public because they want to take a longer-term attitude, but most of it is because they have access to capital now to grow without going public, which is different than 3 decades ago, and they're just worried about the costs and complexities of being public. As a result, the individual investors are being deprived of the opportunity to participate in some of that upside, modifying the accredited investor rule so they can invest in these high-growth companies when they are private would be a step in the right direction.
Very good. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Nebraska, chairman of our Housing and Insurance Committee, Mr. Flood, who is the author of a bill to exclude qualified, no, that's the wrong one. Let me just yield to Mr. Flood for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing topic is near and dear to my heart. How to drive access to capital outside of Silicon Valley and outside of the cities on the coast is something I've worked on since I entered public service in partnership with great state groups like Invest Nebraska. One of the elements that makes Silicon Valley the pinnacle hub of entrepreneurial activity and investment in the country is networks. If you're an aspiring entrepreneur with an idea for a new project, you want to be in the same place as the venture capital firms that could serve as a funding source for you and the talented software engineers that could help you build your project. In other words, a good hub provides both the capital and the labor to make that dream a possibility. The challenge for communities that aren't already in that kind of a hub is, to a certain degree, the name of the game. You can have great schools that are graduating talented young people, but if there isn't the capital available near them, in many cases, they'll leave town and go to a hub that has it all in the same place. What we see is enormous value created in these hubs, vast sums of wealth and opportunity, driven in part by the best and brightest young people that have left behind smaller communities where they grew up. Lots of times, these hub communities rebel against the very growth activity that they enjoy. In some parts of the country, gentrification has become a bad word used to reference out-of-towners who have driven up the cost of goods and housing. The great irony is that there are communities across the country yearning for a fraction of the kind of investment and economic activity that a hub like San Francisco enjoys. In the past, I've been interested in how to build one of these hubs in Nebraska. Books like Brad Feld and Ian Hathaway's The Startup Community Way, Evolving an Entrepreneurial Ecosystem, serve as a potential blueprint on how to get that done, and I've read them with great interest. But I think there's an even bigger picture question underlying the entrepreneurial hub concept. At what point is a geographic hub no longer necessary? Technology has broken down many of the barriers that makes geography such a strong barrier between people. You can hop on a plane to San Francisco and be there within a day. You can communicate with people all across the country and world easily through messaging and video applications. This question is really for all witnesses. I'd like to hear from all of you. I'd be curious to hear from you regarding your thoughts on this topic. Is there a point where these entrepreneurial ecosystems would no longer be necessary at all, or they wouldn't necessarily need to be located in one geographic place? We'll start with you, Mr. Case.
I think we certainly want to build out dozens and dozens of ecosystems, and there's still something, even in a world where there's more virtual, more remote, to having clustering of talent. But it's just unfortunate that the clustering is only happening in places like San Francisco and New York. There's progress in places like Lincoln and Omaha, and even an effort around creating more of a regional hub. So it's a couple of mid-sized cities can work together to create a broader entrepreneurial zone. I think that's a step in the right direction.
I would add that Lincoln, Nebraska, which is the largest city in my district, has seen some success here, but building upon that success is really a question. Mr. Newell.
You know, the thing that I learned in the pandemic was that it was difficult to get the richness of ideas by remote linking to people. There's something valuable about being able to meet a friend at a coffee shop and talk about an idea with them that you can't replace with a Zoom meeting. Now, Zoom meetings can be necessary supplements to it, but I do think the success of the Silicon Valley, Boston, San Diego, other communities has to do with the proximity of people, and that's an important thing that we need to remember. We lost it in the pandemic, and thank God it's coming back.
Yeah, the critical mass is necessary. I would say that, 10 years ago when I got into the tech community, Steve brought the bus through Cincinnati, and at that point, our network really exploded, and we understood what the playbook looked like. And so I think it's necessary as we kind of build out innovation hubs, as you're saying, in Nebraska. We're doing that in Ohio with innovation hubs in our kind of 3C cities. And the critical mass and us being next to each other is important.
Thank you.
I agree with all these comments. You're never going to replace face-to-face interactions, but I also think that technology changes things and makes it more efficient.
Yeah, I'm excited. We have Innovate Alabama, much like Invest Nebraska, and our state has innovation hubs across the state, and we reach all geographic regions of our state. I think it's critically important we have economic incentives and non-economic incentives, and having people collaborate is key to prospering our Alabamians. I mean, our community wants to invest in Alabama. We have attractive geographic, incentives, the beaches, the coast, so we highlight that, and we're excited about bringing entrepreneurs into the state, and I think you guys are in a unique position to be able to go back to your states and help prosper them through those economic hubs. They're a big success in Alabama.
I would be remiss if I didn't also recognize Little Rock, thanks to our chairman and his efforts at innovation and growing jobs and entrepreneurial activity. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes from New York, Mr. Lawler, the Vice Chair for Communications of the committee, and also the author of the Helping Angels Lead Our Startups Halos Act. Mr. Lawler, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Small businesses are now facing these turbulent economic times, having to contend with many regulations that the previous administration put into place, which could stifle economic growth, prevent entrepreneurs from achieving their full potential, and frankly, prevent folks from living out their American dream. Entrepreneurs and small businesses drive the American economy. In 2019, the Small Business Administration calculated that close to 44% of our GDP was a result of small businesses. We should be doing everything we can to promote investment, promote entrepreneurship, and foster small business growth, whether it be cutting red tape, providing additional access to capital, or simply getting government out of the way of entrepreneurship. And that's why I introduced the Helping Angels Lead Our Startups Act, or the HALOS Act, last Congress, and reintroduced it again. The HALOS Act will promote access to investment capital for small companies and ensure that startups can continue to generate interest and connect with investors. It will do this by ensuring that demo days, pitch competitions, and community economic development events where there is no specific investment offering are not considered general solicitation under Reg D. In doing so, companies will be able to engage with a wider audience of investors and spread word of the products and services that they can offer to help develop a thriving and diverse economy. In addition to driving economic force angel investors provide by supporting tens of thousands of small companies per year, long-term impact can be seen as companies such as Amazon, Costco, Facebook, Google, and Starbucks were all initially funded by angel investors. We have seen many successes since the passing of the Bipartisan Jobs Act over a decade ago, which helped reduce barriers to investment. By alleviating burdens on businesses, cutting red tape, and making capital raising in our public markets easier and less costly for emerging companies, not only will we be clearing the way for businesses to expand and develop, but we will also be helping to build a more diverse and inclusive universe of entrepreneurs and founders by expanding opportunities to underrepresented entrepreneurs and communities facing capital formation challenges. The HALOS Act will simply allow folks to get eyes on their businesses and potentially find the vital investor they need to succeed. Think Shark Tank. I look forward to reintroducing the HALOS Act, which passed out of this committee last year, and to seeing it signed into law. Mr. Case, in 2020, the SEC adopted amendments to Reg D to allow for certain demo day communications to be exempt from being considered general solicitation or general advertising. The amendment also defined angel investor group for the purpose of federal securities laws. These changes were made to support startups discussing their products and business plans, demo day events, without it being considered an initial investment offering. How critical are the changes made in 2020 to capital formation, and should Congress solidify these changes by codifying them into law?
No, I support the principles you mentioned. We need to figure out more ways for our entrepreneurs who have ideas to talk about those ideas, including demo days and other gatherings of startups, and educate people about the potential of a particular market, and modifying some of the rules, or perhaps the legislation you're proposing, the bill you're proposing, that would make it easier for angel investors, make it easier for entrepreneurs, would be a step in the right direction.
In your experience, startups generally hesitate to participate in demo days in large measure due to fears of violating securities laws. So do you see that codifying these exemptions would help give entrepreneurs some more confidence in going out and seeking the funding that they need to grow their business?
Yes, I believe it would.
Great. Would anybody else care to comment?
The states certainly support, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Those demo days and pitches, we do it all the time in Alabama, but, you know, as state securities regulators, since we're seeing these operations going on across our state, we just want to be sure that we don't have, and we see it all the time, y'all, I prosecute these cases where you've got a startup that isn't very business savvy, and they're misusing the funds, and they're not doing what they're saying, they're making the misrepresentations. So knowing that they're out there, it's important to sort of help prevent some of that and keep these businesses, like I said, build a good foundation. But you know, the pitches and the demo days are very successful in Alabama.
You know, I think it's important that you spread the message of what you're doing and why it's important and why it's going to be a valuable investment. And the more that you can allow that to happen, the better it will be for the country.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Ogles, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Trotter, I want to revisit Mr. Garbarino's conversation about the closed-end funds and give you a little more opportunity there. But millions of Americans, including many in Middle Tennessee, depend on CEFs as a critical source of retirement savings and investment opportunities. If we're talking about expanding access to capital, CEFs can be a significant force multiplier in helping our fellow citizens achieve the American dream, as you mentioned, Mr. Case. In 2023, total closed-end funds CEF assets were $544 billion. Traditional CEFs had total assets of roughly $250 billion. Unlisted CEFs, including interval funds, tender offer funds, and business development companies, had total assets of $77 billion, $60 and $159 billion, respectively. Unfortunately, the SEC maintains that a closed-end fund should hold no more than 15% of its asset in private funds, and that if a closed-end fund exceeds this amount, the CEF should offer its share to accredited investors, which, as many of my colleagues have noted, is in desperate need of definition upgrade. In the case of CEFs, candidly, there are a few investment vehicles that have more robust investor protections, including investment advisors, directors, extensive disclosures, reporting requirements, et cetera. So, Mr. Trotter, in your view, given these protections, is it a worthwhile trade-off to maintain the SEC staff position, limiting private fund investments to 15% of a CEF's assets? Why or why not?
Well, I think you're putting your finger on, 15% is a little arbitrary. It's a staff position. I think it makes sense to broaden that.
Well, and I think there's the opportunity when you have a fund, they can analyze their own risk, protocols and tolerance, quite frankly. But it does make sense to allow CEFs to invest what they think is basically how they should invest in the private securities. Creating arbitrary anti-free market limitation crowds out the market and needlessly precludes retail investors from critical opportunities. I'm grateful to the gentlewoman from Missouri, the chairwoman of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, for her legislation, the Increasing Investor Opportunities Act, and look forward to working with her on that one. But the current definition of accredited investor limits private market investments to those deemed sophisticated. Mr. Stutzman's bill, the Investment Opportunity Expansion Act, would expand the accredited investor definition to include individuals who invest 10% or less of either their net assets or annual income, whichever is greater, in a private offering. Mr. Case, can you flesh out a little bit for me if the opportunities that an investor would have had in the early days when you were launching AOL versus the regulatory regime that kind of is stymied those opportunities and quite limits the access to that American dream, limits that access to, the returns that you saw under your tenure were phenomenal, of course, right? And not every investment's going to have that, but again, let the free market decide, if you will.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, in the 80s and 90s, when venture capital as a sector, an asset class, was less developed, there was less of it. It was harder to get. And also, once you got to a certain stage, you had to go public in order to access additional capital. Because of the growth of the capital markets and venture capital and later stage growth, companies can stay private longer, and many choose to, and that's totally fine. But as I said earlier, it has the unintended consequence of depriving individual investors, retail investors, of the ability to invest in some of these companies when they're up and running, whether it be AOL or Uber or Amazon or other companies. You might have been a customer of one of those companies, believed in that company, but you didn't have the ability to invest until much, much later when they go public, when they're worth $10 billion or $20 billion or more. And so figuring out ways to allow people to invest in those companies by modifying the accredited investor kind of rules would open up that market to other investors who could then participate in some of the upside of some of these companies. And you note, there are obviously risks associated with that, so you need to figure out how to strike the right balance, but it does feel like it's time to take a fresh look.
Yes, sir. Well, and then, Mr. Newell, would you expand, would an expanded definition of accredited investor have been able to help you as you started your Sutro Biopharma company?
Absolutely. When the company was first started in 2003, it was really friends and family. Venture capital didn't come in for a couple of years. So it was really important to have those angel investors around the table. And the more you have, the more successful you're likely to be with your business.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I think the note here is that obviously we proceed responsibly and with caution, but there's missed opportunities for their retail investor in the sector to win and achieve that American dream. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Michigan, the chair of the Republican Conference, Ms. McClain, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I will try and be quick since we have votes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I'm going to piggyback off what Congressman Ogles was talking about. Ms. Rakeen, what variables other than wealth and income do you think we should consider when expanding the accredited investor definition? And look at it both from both the investor end and the entrepreneurial end?
I would say there's probably two areas that you could look at. Experience would be one of them.
Experience in investing. So have you had 5 years of experience? Is that what you're
Not
saying?
necessarily in investing, but really in different markets. So there could be someone who studied chemistry or biology in college and deeply understands biotech. They have experience in that space. So experience and education could be the way, could be another way to expand that.
And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I want to make sure I understand. So in experience maybe in the sector.
In the sector. Okay, thank you.
And anything else?
I wouldn't want to limit it any more than it already is. I think the point of this is to
agree.
expand it so that capital isn't constricted as much as it is right now.
I agree. Mr. Case, I'd like to hear your opinion on that as well.
I agree that sector expertise it helps, also having some investor expertise, understanding the complexities of these securities and what happens with follow-on rounds, I think is important. A number of the proposals that require some level of education, maybe passing some kind of test would be a step in that right direction.
I'm sorry, passing some kind of test, did you say?
So, some way to make sure that people making these investments understand not just the opportunities, but how the structures work and what some of the risks are.
Yeah.
There are many different ways to do that, but
Sure.
I think that's part of it would, I think, be important.
Very helpful, thank you. Mr. Trotter, we've heard from numerous small business owners in Michigan, my state, who found working with the SEC, me being one of them, over the past years to be extremely frustrating, expensive, complicated, especially the past 4 years. What I'm trying to figure out is, I had my own financial services company at one point. We had more people in the compliance department than we had in the processing department, than we had in the client service department, right? And we were so worried about making a mistake that we spent a lot of resources doing that to make sure that we were compliant. What I'm trying to figure out is, can you discuss ways to actually reduce friction, roadblock, in the registration process or from the SEC? I mean, I think it was started with good motive, but just like everything, I think we're a long way from home.
We've talked about a lot of those ideas. I mean, you have sponsored a bill that would be very helpful in that regard. It doesn't necessarily affect every single company going public, but many companies going public will run into a problem with their auditor independence. And there are private company auditor independence rules that apply to pre-IPO companies, and then the PCAOB and SEC rules are much more rigorous and demanding. And your bill would be very helpful for companies like that
I just want to make sure I get you on record. You'd be in support of that. You think that's a good idea?
Yes, it's a great idea.
Thank you. No, I mean, it is important, and I think we all have good intentions when we put these regulatory bodies together, right? We want to provide guardrails, but at some point, they just grow so big and they get so overwhelming that they actually begin to do the opposite, and they have the opposite effect for both the companies and the investors that we've talked about. So with that, Mr. Chairman, we have votes. I'm going to yield back. Thank you all for your time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Pursuant to the previous order, the chair declares the committee in recess, subject to the call of the chair. We will reconvene immediately following the last vote in this series of floor votes, so the committee stands in recess.
Okay.
The committee will reconvene and come to order following our recess. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Dela Cruz, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. Do appreciate it. Texas has homes to over, or is home to over 3.3 million small businesses and is a destination for businesses of all sizes. My district is all the way down in deep South Texas, a very rural area, hard to raise capital, but very entrepreneurial. And in fact, I myself am a small business owner and have been blessed to open several different types of small businesses. And so I understand how challenging it can be, especially in a minority community like mine is, being a female and then opening a small businesses with all the challenges. My question is directed to Mr. Brackeen. What are some of the issues startups face when they are located in more rural districts like mine?
Good afternoon, and thank you, Congresswoman. So I would say it depends on kind of the small rural region. So is it covered in the county? Does that county or city support economic development work? So is there educational programming available? So I think there are a lot of different things that people need beyond just capital. So if your region doesn't have kind of economic development work happening within it, you sometimes don't know how to access those things. So what is that center point within your community that can help you to grow and thrive as a business? Is that the SBA? Is that a SCORE mentor? Is that just someone who has set up a local innovation hub? All of those things are necessary to help a company to grow.
Thank you so much. And your misses, I'm sorry.
That's okay. We're all moving fast.
We are moving fast here. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And you're absolutely right. As I said, I've been blessed to be a part of many different types of businesses, opening them by myself. And sometimes you just don't know where to start. And if you're not in a community that has a small business association or a university that has an SBA area that can help you, then you can feel quite lost and overwhelmed, right? And as a small business owner myself, like I said, sometimes with those challenges, especially the capital challenge, then they often close. What is the statistic? Do you know something like 50% of small business openings close within the first 3 years?
Well, I'm not certain of the small business number, but I know for tech companies, it's 8 fail out of 10 generally, right? So that number is really high at the early kind of pre-seed, seed stage. It's later where they start to grow, but I don't know that small business number.
8 out of 10 is very high. What do you think some of the steps for Congress or that Congress could take in order to assist?
Well, I would say more support around technical assistance for companies. I would say there isn't really a nationwide push behind helping with technical assistance for technology companies. The Small Business Administration is still supporting, in general, Main Street businesses. That could be through other orgs like ours, where we support through kind of economic development work. We're in 7 cities in the state of Ohio and 9 cities elsewhere in the country. So that is one area. Another is just making it easier for capital to flow throughout all of the states. So SSBCI has been brought up several times today. I would say continuing that program is incredibly important. It has helped to capitalize lots of companies that were started in garages and labs across the country.
Thank you. Mr. Trotter, how can we make public markets more attractive?
Well, continue with the success of the Jobs Act. So in particular, make it easier to go public. And then once you are public, make it easier to be a new public company and entice companies that are considering an IPO by lowering the cost of being a new public company for a meaningful period of time after the IPO. I think those would all be helpful steps, and you can do all of those by expanding the definition of emerging growth company.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Downing, on this. Always good to have an Air Force guy as your wingman up in the seat there. We appreciate it, certainly, as a combat veteran ourselves. Let me begin by iterating. The U.S. capital markets remain the envy of the entire world. We have a lot of good opportunity here. Our markets provide unrivaled liquidity. They have transparency, competition, rule of law, which help millions of Americans, including millions right in my home state of Iowa. The challenge, however, is despite our nation's financial strength, access to capital remains overly concentrated, particularly in the East and West. I see my colleague from Alabama nodding her head. This is the reality. Last year alone, 33,000 new small businesses launched in Iowa, but our markets still fail to reflect their growth. Imagine the economic power if we were able to bring more of this capital to the heart of the heartland. Now, Ms. Matthews Bekreen, excuse me, you're an Ohio gal. You recognize this firsthand. I think that you know that we struggle with our traditional financial centers when it comes to raising that initial funding. Limited availability of initial capital outside of major investment hubs reinforces a pattern, matching a tendency for fund startups to resemble what we've seen in the past, which makes it even more difficult for a Central America opportunity to get outside of Boston or New York or Miami or Silicon Valley. All great places, but we've got an opportunity right here. You've helped lead some real successful examples of what securing capital in the Midwest might look at. Some of the key factors that we should focus on to increase and lower barriers for small companies. Tell me how Ohio and Iowa could better fit into this model.
I think we need to look a little bit at the model that you see on the coast, but we also need to fit it to ourselves, right? I would say in the Midwest, we are more thoughtful about the way that we spend money. And so first and foremost, we make certain that companies are generating revenue, that they can see growth. And we can really build our own model. So earlier today, I talked about Ohio Third Frontier and Jobs Ohio. Those are the ways that we are capitalizing our businesses and putting Ohio companies first. I think Iowa could definitely do the same thing, and you're seeing that across the country, and those things work quite well.
Ken, I couldn't agree with you more, and I think you're right. There's a model we can use on both sides of this. As we look at the lack of small businesses in our public markets now, they're deprived of the investing opportunities to invest in high growth companies, primarily because they don't have the same opportunity. Have you seen opportunities for businesses in Ohio or other places to be able to capitalize on those high return yields?
You know, that's not a question that I don't think I could answer, but Joel, do you want to take that one?
All right, Mr. Trotter, she just teed it up for you, brother.
Well, I don't have an easy answer to that question. I mean, my emphasis, again, is on improving capital formation by principally expanding the category of emerging growth company and expanding the well-known seasoned issuer definition. And I think all of the proposals before you are are steps in the right direction. They all help facilitate capital formation and take down some of the barriers that are unnaturally inhibiting steps to grow capital and raise capital and help businesses grow.
So, Mr. Trotter, on that example, I'll take you one step further. The Jobs Act created the EGC designation, which is an example that grants certain smaller companies relief from specific disclosure compliance requirements for a limited period and helps ease their transition effectively into the public market. I have a bill that would allow EGCs to present a 2 years of audit financial statement. It would, rather than what's currently out there right now, 3, in both the IPO and spinoff transaction. Is this an example of something that could help us get into the public market space? And if so, how?
Yes, that's definitely a great example. So EGCs, when they go public, they can go public with 2 years. But there are these aberrational circumstances that your bill would address, where experience has shown that despite having gone public with 2 years, for whatever weird reason, they're required to present a 3rd year. And it makes no sense. There's no easy path for relief for those companies. So, and addressing that scenario in a spinoff scenario, as well as a case where maybe a newly public emerging growth company has acquired another company and they have to come up with a 3rd year of target financial statements. That makes no sense in those situations. So you're fixing parts of the rules where there's an extra burden that really shouldn't be there.
Hopefully that's a good on-ramp. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I yield the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. And first, without objection, I enter into the record a comment letter from the Institute for Portfolio Alternatives. So ordered. Montana is a very rural state. And according to the SBA, about more than 99% of Montana businesses are considered or classified as small businesses. And they employ a supermajority of the state, 67% of Montanans. I have a lot of experience dealing with the challenges of a startup, especially in a rural state. And this is mostly a comment. I really appreciate some of the comments that we've had on the unique challenges that rural startups face. But I'm going to start on something a little bit different. One of the issues that I've had in my career before politics is like the definition of accredited investors. It's something that that bugged me because it seemed like it disqualified a lot of Americans from being able to participate in alternatives. And it was a big problem for that. And so, Mr. Trotter, the current accredited investor standard limits investments in the private market dollars and net worth over $1 million. And the median income in Montana is about $71,000, with only 8% of households making $200,000 or more. And over 99% of U.S. companies are not publicly traded. So my question is, does this deny retail investors growth and diversity in their retirement accounts when they can essentially only invest in less than 1% of U.S. companies?
Yes, it does. And I've been to a number of these hearings where a lot of emphasis is placed on this definition. It does seem like there's room for common sense expansion of the definition and to take a more permissive approach.
Right. I've always struggled with the fact that you could have no experience and a lot of money and you're qualified, or you can have a lot of experience and not enough money and you're not qualified. And thank you for your answers there. So I'm going to go to Ms. Brakeen. So most VC funding, venture capital funding, is concentrated in California, Massachusetts, and New York. Again, struggled with this, trying to start a startup company outside of California. And we've discussed a lot today on how new challenges are needed to expand venture capital access to other states like Montana. The 2012 Jobs Act contains several provisions to make raising capital in private markets easier. So after the passage of the Jobs Act, did you see some venture capital funding going to other areas that would demonstrate the need for Congress to do more now?
Yeah, so I will say that I have been in the tech industry specifically for the last 10 years. So some of that was before my time. Okay. However, I will state that SSBCI funding did get put into the state of Ohio, and it helped launch 3 major funds in our state, Cincy Tech, Rev 1, and Jumpstart. We have seen incredible economic development in our state because of that. And I think that states like yours and Montana could see the same if we continue those programs.
Thank you. Shifting on to Mr. Newell. The U.S. has recorded several of its worst years on record for initial public offerings, as costs associated with going public have doubled since the 1990s. Costs are crazy. Gary Gensler, the former chair of the SEC, never proposed a single rulemaking to make raising capital easier. In fact, he pushed policies to make private markets less attractive, like adding costly regulatory requirements and disclosures on private funds. So can you explain why it's a bad idea to try to force companies to go public when they're not ready?
You know, the regulatory burden of becoming a public company is not insubstantial. The accounting costs that are required can run into the millions of dollars. And, you know, that's money that is not going to advancing your business. That's not money going to hire new employees. That is money going to satisfy accounting requirements that frankly are not right-sized for the business at that point in time. So it acts as a great deterrent, and I would say that, you know, you have to think carefully about going public. It's one of these, be careful what you wish for because you might get it. And there are a lot of things that if you're not well advised, you're going to discover that you now need to triple the size of your accounting force, your finance team, just to meet compliance requirements when really, that's not necessary for investor protection. There are other investor protections we have as well, and we've talked about a lot of them here today.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and I thank all the witnesses for your time today. This has been very useful and informative. I yield my time, and I'd like to thank you all for your testimony, and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to chair. The questions will be forwarded to the witness for his response or her response. Witnesses, please respond no later than April 29th, 2025. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.